I am Sarah the Raging Tomato here, bringing to you live a Moderator Monday. This evening, I have Ken Harbro, notsoErudite, made by Jim Bob and Jake from Rattlesnake TV, here bringing to you another debate questioning: is feminism good for society? Ken, why don't you go ahead and kick it off?
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. Good to be here. Looking forward to a spirited conversation. As Sarah mentioned, I'm Ken Harbaugh, former Navy pilot and a combat recon mission commander. Since leaving the Navy, I've led a disaster relief organization, deployed to disaster and conflict zones around the world, most recently Ukraine, where I'm headed back in a few weeks. And in every one of those situations, from flying missions off of North Korea to being at the front in Ukraine, I have worked alongside women who I would trust my life with, who I did trust my life with. And my friends on the opposing side arguing against feminism are probably going to try to convince you that feminism is about lowering standards, among other things. It's not. Trust me, at times my life depended on those standards being upheld, and they were. Feminism is about giving a society the chance to achieve its full promise by unleashing the potential of everyone, men and women alike. Feminism is about opportunities. I guarantee you that the other thing the opposing side is going to do is cherry pick outlier data points. They'll do this to argue that the goal of feminism is to erase distinctions. And they'll try to convince you that a handful of ridiculous examples describe feminism writ large. It's an old debating trick, and it's not going to work, because feminism is about creating opportunities for the best contributions to be made to society. And that makes us better. It makes us stronger across every conceivable metric: economic growth, innovation, medical advancements. This approach towards fairness has made life better. And I could cite study after study, from the OECD to the World Bank to McKinsey, showing that in every society where feminism prevails, productivity increases, institutions are strengthened. But you don't have to believe the researchers, the experts. Just trust your own intuition. Think about societies that do not live up to the promise of feminism. I have been to these places. I have seen firsthand what happens when those who want to tear down and lie about feminism actually win the argument. And believe me, you don't want to live there. I've been to Afghanistan. I've flown missions against Iran. That is where the other side's argument leads. Thanks.
Thank you, Ken. Kyla, to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ken did a pretty fantastic job. He's spitting, as one might say. I mean, my answer is pretty simple. Is feminism good for society? Yes. I think it's important that you separate out feminism from feminists. I think there will be lots of things where we might argue feminism went too far, or feminists themselves have erred. And I'm just kind of happy to bite all those bullets. But when you look at like a broad societal brush of what feminism does, if feminism, which operation I would work off of feminism, saying it's a philosophy of empowering women, right? I think feminism is the morally right thing to do. I think it's good for innovation. I think it's good for productivity and the GDP. And I think those things lead to a better, flourishing society. So yes, I am for feminism.
Thank you. Jim Bob, to you. You're muted, Jim Bob.
The question is feminism good for society? To me, that's like asking if mold is good for a house. To answer this question, whether or not feminism is good for society, we should first establish what it actually is. Feminism is the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of equality of the sexes. Without the flowery language, feminism is a movement away from patriarchy. Simply put, the question becomes, is the movement away from patriarchy good for society? I would say no. So what is good for society? Well, let's just keep some basic bullet points here. So my argument is that traditional families are good for society. Not only good, but they're necessary, a necessary component for a flourishing society. Law and order, those are not only good for society, but they're necessary for society. Order is not only good, but any society you point to, it has some feature of order and law. Order assumes both hierarchy and force. I want you to remember that throughout the debate here. The third, and perhaps one of the more important bullet points, is duties and obligations. I would argue a society that has duties and obligations is better. It's a better society because they have duties and obligations. Any ordered system with people, there are duties and obligations. If we look at a company, for instance, it's structured with a hierarchy and everyone in the company has a duty and obligation. This is good for the company. The same way this is good for the company, this is good for society. However, feminism has no duties and obligations. What feminism has is a series of grievances and demands of which no collective of women could actualize. So instead, feminism relies wholly on men. Feminism is basically a live action role-playing game. Now let's see if feminism supports any of these things. Again, traditional families, law and order, duties and obligations. Does feminism support traditional families? No. Predominant messaging from feminism, not just feminists, feminism opposes the traditional family structure. It calls single motherhood empowering. It says having children hinders your potential. Its messaging says that killing your offspring in the womb is an act of liberation. Feminism does not produce positive messaging for motherhood. It produces negative messaging for motherhood. Now, the second bullet point, does feminism support order in society? No, feminism assumes in its very definition that men and women are interchangeable. They are not. Its messaging is anti-patriarchy. Feminism argues for equal rights and privileges between men and women while simultaneously relying on a one-sided system of men who protect and enforce those rights and privileges. It's completely one-sided. It's completely patriarchal. Does feminism support duties and obligations? No, feminism supports the sole pursuit of women's desire. The only obligation under feminism is to undermine patriarchy. But now that men can be women, I'm not sure what goals are left for feminists other than destroying what the remnant, what's remnant of traditional Western societies and their values. Under the feminist framework, there are no duties assigned to women which produce a good for society. They're just privileges and things they like. There's no feminism that can build a good society. It requires men. It requires patriarchy. Patriarchy is in opposition to feminism. So the task tonight for our opponents is to tell us how feminism is good for society. My prediction is that anything they point to as a good will ultimately be reliant on men. I'm going to leave you with a simple syllogism here. Premise 1, a good society requires law and order. Premise 2, law and order requires the force of men. Premise 3, a society that requires the force of men is actually a patriarchy. Conclusion, a patriarchy is good for society. Now notice if I swap out feminism, patriarchy for feminism, watch what happens. A good society doesn't require feminism at all. Feminism does require the force of men. A society that requires the force of men can't be feminist. It just can't be definitionally. So there's nothing good that feminism brings at all without it being a pretend sort of live action role-playing game that relies wholly on men using their force, men's obligation to put their body as a shield, to protect women, to protect families, to protect children. Women offer nothing in return. The obligations are all there for men. There's zero obligations for women.
Thank you, Jim Bob. Jake, to you.
Yes, thank you very much for having me, Sarah. Thank you to the opponents for coming out today as well, and Jim Bob too. So feminism, I'm going to go with the same definition as Jim Bob, and I think that it has destroyed the relationship between the sexes. It's a raw deal for men, and it's also a raw deal for women. And what's more problematic is that feminism is explicitly designed to destroy the family unit, which is the bedrock of a healthy civilization. And this is echoed throughout feminist literature. You look at people like Simone de Beauvoir, who say that the family is the most important social institution in maintaining the oppression of women. Shulamith Firestone from The Dialectic of Sex said the family is the first system of oppression. It is also the most pervasive, and there are many more. We can go through them a bit more if we have a little bit of time later. So the family is the bedrock of civilization, and the feminists are crusaders for destroying and subverting this institution with their seething resentment. And when you destroy the family and women leave the home to write emails, you inevitably end up having to give your children off to the state. And this is not a new idea. This has been echoed throughout history. Even Plato in his Republic said that children are to be common and no parent is to know his own child or any child his parent. Engels, who wrote the Communist Manifesto, echoed something similar. Even John Stuart Mill and Antonio Gramsci, very famous communist there, echoing similar sentiments. So how does this directly relate to feminism, you might ask? Well, feminists ask for and have largely attained equal participation in the workforce, separating them from family duties and handing the children off to the state for public education. This is absolutely pervasive throughout the West at the moment, and the family structures have suffered for it. Divorce rates are much higher. Children are being handed off to the state. We have a much more impersonal relationship with our family these days. And once again, key feminist figures like Simone de Beauvoir argue that to achieve true gender equality, society must support shared responsibilities for child rearing, including state-sponsored childcare and education systems that free women from the pressure of full-time domestic work. So, last thing I would say here is that, and I think we can just pretty much cover all this in the open dialogue, but feminism is not only a horrible deal for men, it is also just a terrible deal for women. And the best thing that women can do is to completely and utterly reject feminism. Because if you want to follow the feminist messaging and propaganda, they will tell you that the sexes should be equal. This is a pipe dream. This is never going to happen. It's completely impossible. They're never going to be able to be equal to men in the things that they strive for. So therefore, it can never happen. And we can go through force doctrine and how that's actually a logical impossibility. So they'll never be equal to men. It's a bad deal. And feminism is an ideology that would be best left in the dust of history. So happy to get into it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate it. As a kind reminder, everybody here is dual streaming. So if you feel free to run over to their channels, like, subscribe, share, do your job as the viewer. And again, we will always be doing open panel dumpster fire. We will have the debate, read and respond to super chats after closing statements. Then we will open up the floor to the public. Outside of that, folks, the floor is open to you.
I guess maybe what I would start with is the definition you guys gave of patriarchy was very kind of goes against any traditional definition that I've experienced, right? Which typically I think like Wikipedia and stuff would call it like some sort of hierarchical system where positions of authority are held by men. But it seems like you guys are actually calling patriarchy the enforcement arm, that the enforcement arm is mostly occupied by men, and therefore that's what a patriarchy is. So do you guys think a patriarchy is where men are soldiers and police officers, or do you think a patriarchy is when men are in positions of power?
Well, I would say positions of power are useless without the force application. So whatever you think is a position of power ultimately comes down to force anyway. So men in power, ultimately backing power and enforcing law and rights. They could put women in different positions, but that's an allowance. They don't have to. In fact, at any given time, the collection of men in any given country can completely overturn any of the allowances they give to women at any point in time.
Gotcha. So like society, for example, runs on the back of workers, right? If we don't have workers, laborers, janitors, farmers, et cetera, the society wouldn't work. That doesn't mean that society is run by workers though, right? That doesn't mean societies are running the country.
No, I would say that's disanalogous. What's productive in this example, you're arguing what's productive. We're arguing how do you even maintain the order in society such that production is even possible?
Okay, so you're
skipping to some particular, but we're talking about how do you even have production a possibility without order, law and order? So you just granted yourself law and order so you can have production and work. By the way, your example points to productivity. The point is feminism good for society? Is it better to have productive women or to have women mother the next generation of children?
So I'm a bit curious. So say there was a society.
Wait, you didn't answer my question though. You said you're curious, but I asked you a direct question because this is a cross-examination. So is it better for women collectively, for the most part, to be rearing and having children for the next generation of the society that you want to flourish? Or should they go to the workforce and be awesome?
I don't see these things as mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
So you're not going to answer the question? Which is
my answer is these things are not mutually exclusive.
Which
you're
is
begging
better
the question.
for society?
You're begging the question with the question. They're not mutually exclusive concepts.
Okay, so if you were to choose to have a bunch of women, right, and you either choose for the society on net balance that they should have children for the next generation and mother those good people, or join Nike and get a lanyard in an office, what do you think is better for society?
Well, I mean, society would just...
Hypothetical.
Sure. We can go into your hypothetical and I'll just engage with it. Obviously, you need
Except you won't.
Well, I will. Obviously, you need to have children for society to even continue. The problem is that the hypothetical is disanalogous to anything that we're talking about, right? Because the problem is that in a society with freedoms and rights, things don't exist in these mutually exclusive vacuums. And so in no world are people having to choose between one or the other. Women can typically occupy multiple roles.
We're under replacement right now. So we're actually in a predicament right now where we have to decide whether or not we're going to use massive amounts of social pressure and propaganda to get women away from your ideal of feminism and back into the home rearing children and having children and families.
What's my ideal of feminism?
Because we're not going to have enough people for the next generation.
What's my ideal of feminism?
So what's important right now? You feeling good and going on a Eat, Pray, Love tour and blogging about it, or the next generation of women, women and children?
Okay, so
which is more important?
Part of the issue, so if I could just break this down, part of the issue with your argumentation is you're making a bit of a syllogism, right? So you're saying that society doesn't work without soldiers. Soldiers are men. Therefore, men run society. Am I understanding you correctly?
Well, that was one aspect. The force doctrine is not something you're going to get away from. I'm happy to shift over to the force doctrine. But what I just pointed to is, what's the obligation for feminists to make society good if you have no obligation to reproduce?
I don't really understand your question.
Why are you acting confused?
I don't understand your question.
Feminism is good for society, right? I just asked you, what obligation does feminism have to reproduce for women?
Because women obviously want a flourishing society as well.
No, I didn't ask what you want. I said, do you have an obligation to?
I guess I'm not understanding your question.
Do you have an obligation, not so erudite, to reproduce?
No, nobody does.
You don't. Does any feminist that you know have the obligation to reproduce?
I don't think any human being has an obligation to reproduce.
Do men collectively have the obligation to uphold and enforce the law with their bodies?
No, they do not have an obligation to do that.
They don't. They don't have an obligation. So,
nope.
So if men don't have an obligation to do anything and women don't have an obligation to do anything, how the fuck are you going to argue feminism from your worldview is good for anything?
I'm not going to lie. I don't even know if you know what this means. Like, I don't even know if you know what you're talking about.
No, stop gaslighting me. I just asked you a direct question.
Okay.
I just asked you a direct question. If men from your worldview have no obligation and women have no obligation, can you tell me how anything from your worldview is good for society with no obligations?
So social contracts establish obligations. The issue is that, like, your gender, for example, isn't the thing that establishes the obligation necessarily. It's the social contract. So if you're in the military, you have an obligation, right? So if you join the military, which you do freely of will, you have an obligation to serve and protect, to listen to your sergeants, to do all the things that you're contracted to do as you join the military contract, right? Those are obligations that you have. When you are born, you have some level of contract that you necessarily establish with your sovereign state. So if you're a citizen of America, you have certain obligations to uphold, for example, by and large, trying to follow the rules of the founding documents. You're supposed to, by and large, vote.
Law?
Yeah. Law.
Yeah, but you just contradicted yourself. If by being a part of the society, you have an obligation to follow the law, and you don't have an obligation to actually enforce the law from your view, you just said men don't have an obligation to enforce the law. So you have an obligation to follow the law, but you don't have an obligation to enforce it?
No, nobody has an obligation. Men don't have to be police officers or military
So then why do I have
members.
an obligation from your view to follow the law?
Because you're in a social contract with your society, right? So you don't have to be...
By being bored?
Yeah, by being bored and getting a U.S. passport and, birth certificate.
Okay, so from your view, everything's contractual.
Well, you're talking about obligations, right? So you're asking me to establish where obligations are, and social contracts are typically how we establish those obligations in a democracy.
Okay, so how is feminism good for whatever you're calling good right now, which is a set of what? Just like arbitrary contracts between individuals? Is that it? Is that your vision of society?
Well, the thing that I love most about a democratic society, for example, is freedom of choice, right? So I think one thing that feminism does really well is it increases the agency by which women have to live, which I think is good. Typically, women will opt to use that agency to enter into obligatory contracts, such as with their workplace.
You mean contracts that are backed by force?
Force or civil law or threat.
Yeah. Or is that force predominantly men?
Again, just because a society requires, if we had slaves that were all of our police force, we wouldn't say that slaves are running the country.
That's not what I asked you. I said, is the force application in a society that has laws and contracts that can be policed and enforced, is it wholly dependent on mostly men to enforce those? In other words, if you swapped out all the men in the enforcement arm with women, do you think a pure collection of women could enforce flawed contracts and breach contracts between men?
Jim Bob, have you ever been to?
I just asked a question. Hold on. No, don't ask me a question right now. You can answer the question.
It was a question. It was a question.
Don't save her. I know you like saving women, but this is on her unless you want to answer it.
What's the question again? Happy to.
You didn't even hear the question.
No, because you've been rambling like you live in this theoretical world.
Just stop.
All right, gentlemen, that's enough. Jim Bob, would you like to ask your question again, and then either Ken or Kyla can give an answer?
Is it possible for a collective of women to be the enforcement arm of a society?
100%. 100%. If you go to Israel right now, when's the last time you've been to Israel?
Israel, a lot of those women have dicks.
Could Jim Bob answer any of my questions yet? Because I've answered all of his. Well, I don't want to stop Ken.
I want to hear about Israel. I want to hear about Israel.
It's just, I feel like Jim Bob is doing this very
Ben Gurion Airport. Sorry, Kyla, go ahead.
Tell us your poetry.
No, I want to hear about Israel.
Go ahead, Kyla, ask your question.
Well, it's just, I've asked a number of questions, and I'm just, I guess, at a meta level. I'm not really sure how to engage with you, Jim Bob, because the last time you asked me about the enforcement arm, I answered your question, and you told me to stop talking about it because you didn't like my answer. So you can't Mott and Bailey this back and forth. Every time that you don't know how to continue your own interrogation, it doesn't mean that I'm not answering your questions.
No one cares about your Yelp review, okay, lady? Look, I asked you a question about something specific, and you moved over to enforcement. I said I'm happy to talk about enforcement, but I wasn't talking about that. I was talking about obligations under feminism.
Let me ask you my question now. Can I ask you my question now?
You went blank when I asked you, is there any obligations at all under feminism? Because that's a worldview, right? That's a worldview you're defending. There's no obligations.
So feminism isn't a hierarchical structure. This is the problem. You're conflating. Nope. So what you're doing is you're doing the sleight of hand where you're saying things like...
You're back to meta. I'm not doing arguments, just meta.
Well, the problem is that it's impossible to engage with you without addressing any of the meta because you're constantly doing a sleight of hand where you shift from talking about hierarchical obligations such as citizenry. Can I finish my thoughts before I get interrupted?
Let her finish, please. Let her finish.
Feminism has no hierarchy?
Do I get to finish or do I... So, no, feminism is not an erection. So, for example, if you said matriarchies, we could talk about a matriarchy hierarchy, right? However, the issue is that what you're doing is you're talking about obligations and hierarchical systems, and then you're swapping that really quickly to say, see, feminism isn't establishing. What obligations does it have? It's not a hierarchy. Feminism isn't a philosophical or political structure of hierarchy. It's about the empowerment of women. It's about increasing women's agency.
What does that mean, empowerment?
Well, if I think you're Christian, right? So what does it mean? What does it mean when God empowers you as a Christian?
We're not talking about a Christian view. We're asking
about
your view.
Answer my question? What does it mean?
No, I just asked you, what does empowerment mean?
Why do I have to answer your questions, but you can't engage in my questions? I don't understand.
You're unbelievable amount of dodging here.
Well, you're just interrupting me all the time and not answering my questions.
Can you clarify?
You're like, what do you think it means? What are you talking about? I just asked you, under your view, under feminism, what is empowerment? You're like, Jim Bob, are you Christian? No, that's not what we're talking about. What does empowerment
I am asking
mean?
you. Just follow me for a second. It's okay. We're all safe here. Okay. Do you believe? You asked me about empowerment. Jim Bob, I need you to control your emotions. Here? I need you to stop interrupting and control your emotions for just 1 second. So you asked me about empowerment, and for looking for common ground, I said, well, you're a Christian. So what does it mean when God empowers you? That's what I'm asking you. Because I think we'll have a similar answer there.
I don't share that platitude, okay? That's not my theology. I don't go, God empowers me, okay? That's not even in my paradigm right now.
Do you think that God gives you
your
choice?
Own platitudes and bumper stickers apply to me, and it's a way for you to dodge the question. You said...
So you don't think that God empowers Christians?
I said...
have choice?
Give me an example under feminism of women being empowered. Is offing your offspring empowering under feminism?
So you don't believe that God empowers Christians to make a choice?
Question.
I've answered multiple questions multiple times.
Would Jake and Ken like to kind of maybe chime in here?
Let's pretend I'm a Satanist and I don't care about any empowerment for a second. Okay.
It was just great. I thought you were Christian. I thought we had a common ground. I don't know why you're dodging the question. You can dodge the question, but we should go to Ken and Jake.
All right.
It's okay. You're okay, Jim Bob. We're safe.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I would like to know, Ken, how exactly is... So you think you're trying to tell me that if they took all of the men away and they took all of the men out of the IDF, then all of the women would be able to fight Hamas and Iran just fine?
No, the question was about an enforcement mechanism. And if you look at the police force in Israel right now, if you go through Ben Gurion Airport, it is 90% female, and they do a hell of a job.
Airport.
You do not want to take on...
Because they're patting people...
Just how theoretical your arguments are, your worldview is.
Theoretical?
Jake,
just pointed to an airport.
Please let him finish.
You're referring to a philosopher who was born 120 years ago as your basis for explaining feminism. That's just not the world we live in today.
That's when feminism began.
The reality is, when you look at women's role in the military, for example, on the front lines, and my guess is y'all haven't been within 20 clicks of an actual trench or an actual fight. I've actually been in
Make an argument.
And
wow,
I've put my life in the hands of women who have saved it on more than one occasion. I would do it again. And there are plenty of examples throughout history, in society even today. Go back to, Boudicca taking on the Romans and beating them in Great Britain, up to the women
with an army of men,
and up to the women in Israel today. Who, I would put the lionesses against Hamas any day. I've seen that up close in Ukraine. The most feared units in some of those areas at the front are about female units. And look, I think that you're great at the theory. You're great at bringing up the philosophers who are 120 years old, but in terms of real experience, go live a little. Go talk to an actual woman.
How is this an argument?
This is not an argument, dude. This is just emotional.
What is this, part of your journal?
This idea that women are somehow unable to do both. Look, I've got 3 kids, right? And I'm a feminist, married to a feminist. If your sole objective of the woman's role in society is procreating, we're managing to do both. So I'm bringing in actual experience on top of your theory to prove the point.
Whose word wins?
Whose
word wins in the house with you?
Allow me to make a clarification here. Anecdotal usually doesn't work very well in terms of a debate, Ken. So I have an appreciation for experience and anecdotal, stories and so on and so forth. But as far as making an argument goes, it doesn't really get anywhere in terms of a debate is formed.
Let's take you back to the topic. Feminism is good for society. The question is, does Ken know some tough chicks? Would you agree, Ken, that a good society requires law and order?
Absolutely. I've been part of enforcing.
Oh, no. We don't need a big story, dude. Stop.
Well, Jabab, you should be able to control your emotions enough that you can stay in your seat and keep your mouth shut when he's talking. The man is talking. You can control yourself.
I'm going
you can
to
breathe.
separate the two of you if you don't stop.
I'm trying to run a line of argument, and ERUDITE's
you're interrupting the moderator too.
Thing, right? You guys save each other.
Well, you're interrupting the moderator. You're interrupting me. You're interrupting Ken. I get it. I get it. You're the Andrew Wilson clone. You took his models.
Okay, let me. I knew the two of you would be definitely at each other's throats. So let me just make some clarifying points here. The interruptions don't help. I know I said this before. If somebody isn't getting there, you got to let them spit it out, and then, we can intervene as we need to, but try not to interrupt. We want to be able to make our point. So if you could I will tell them to land the plane. If I need to, I will get there, but the interruptions don't help.
I want to continue with the Israel and the airport. So, Ken, what exactly is your claim here? You're saying that the women are the enforcement arm of the IDF in Israel?
Yeah, my claim is, well, you're conflating the IDF with the airport enforcement, but that's beside the point. My claim is that feminism.
So you're talking about the people who pat people down.
Sorry, say that. I didn't hear you.
So then you're talking about the people who pat you down at the airport and put you through the electrical machines.
Oh, and stop the terrorists from blowing up planes.
Do they? Do they stop them all with force? They're diving.
So
yeah,
Okay.
I mean,
what about on the front lines? Because I'm sure
over an El Al plane.
I mean, I'm sure that you're aware, Ken, that they're currently fighting a war. What kind of an involvement do women have in that war?
Pretty significant, especially when it comes to the checkpoints and making sure. I mean, look, I'm not an expert on the IDF. I am an expert on the U.S. military and the role of women in Afghanistan, for example, on the front lines, or in Ukraine right now. I can absolutely speak with a fair amount of authority on that. And look, women have a absolutely vital role to play, and I think the best way to prove that.
So what is their role, though? Like, just what exactly is their role?
The best way to prove the point is give you the example of what happens when you don't allow the best in society to fill those roles. You have an army like.
It's not my question. It's not my question.
The best would be men. The best would be men anyway.
Again and again. And look, some of the best pilots I flew with were women.
Dude, this is anecdotal, Ken. It's a really weak argument. Can we stick to the argument that we're talking about? We're talking about Israel right now, and you're saying that your claim before was essentially that if you look around Israel, that the women are the enforcement arm. Was that your claim, or were you just saying that they pat you down at the airport?
My claim was that their security, what keeps Israeli travelers safe, is women, and that is a very dangerous environment.
Okay, and then who do you think is fighting on the front lines in the current war that they've got at the moment when they're going into Gaza and doing ground invasions in Gaza? Is it men or is it women?
It's men and women. Again, I would rather speak to something
equal.
Probably not equal. No, definitely not equal.
Well, we're being charitable here because Israel probably does have the largest amount of women because the women get conscripted, but it's mostly in support roles. And if you look at the death toll, there's been 891 deaths of the IDF during this war, and 757 of them have been men.
Yeah, men serve in disproportionate numbers, but it is to the strength of Israeli society. It is to the strength of Israeli society that they are able to pick the best people for those really difficult missions. And feminism allows women to have those opportunities and defend Israeli society. Without it, you get weaker societies like Afghanistan, like Iran. And
well, Israel is an example where they actually get conscripted, but they get conscripted into support roles. Right.
Well,
so if you look at other countries where it's not conscription, these women actually don't even volunteer for the army. It's all men who do it. And you're talking about US. Let's talk about something that you.
So in Ukraine,
sure.
Example,
let's talk about. Okay. Well, let's just talk about something that you're really familiar with.
Through the roof, and
what's the death toll?
Women volunteering for frontline roles, Ukraine would have been rolled over.
I've seen them making the TikToks. I've seen it. So what's the death toll in Ukraine, men to women?
I don't know.
Well, we've already granted. Well, he's already granted
much less than 1%.
Well, everyone here, I don't think anyone here would say, for example, that men don't disproportionately represent military. Like, nobody's arguing with you on that, Jake. I think the more pertinent question that Ken is posing is, if the best person for every position in the military is a man, why are militaries that are all men dog shit, like North Korea or Hamas?
What? How do you determine their dog shit? What do you mean? How do you measure that?
Do you think that Hamas and North Korea are excellent military systems?
How are you measuring? You made the claim. Don't ask me. You're the one who made the claim.
Okay, I think just by looking at it.
How did you measure? No, wait, hold on. No,
North Korea is notably
saving her.
Okay, Jim Bob, do you think that the North Korean army is super strong and capable and powerful and worth fearing, or do you think the American military is better?
I've not gone into gauging that, but you made a statement that you did. So
do you think that Hamas could compete with America?
You keep asking me a question based on your claim. Is that your tactic?
Yeah,
you made.
I guess
claim.
it is.
Yeah, it is your tactic.
Well, I'm incredulous, right? I think it's pretty silly to even ask me this. It's pretty obvious. It's pretty obvious that North Korea and Hamas and Eritrea are garbage. Pretty obvious.
You just say shit, and then when you're asked, how do you verify that? You say, well, what do you think?
Well, I thought we weren't talking about the meta anymore, Jim Bob.
Nice work. let's get back to the topic. Why
are you dodging the question so much?
Name one way in America. How is feminism good for society? That's the topic.
Great. I'll give you a way. It allows the best people to be able to, in some cases they're women, to be able to contribute that talent to society. And I think the military, which is my source of experience, is a phenomenal example of that. America has the best military in the world. I defy you to name another military, save perhaps Ukraine, that can.
Do we have the best Navy SEALs, you think?
And it's because we allow the best people to fill those roles, and sometimes they happen to be women.
Well,
feminism isn't about making sure that there is 50-50 representation. So that whole argument,
I don't really.
Israel and Ukraine is just a canard. Feminism isn't about 50-50 representation. It's about making sure you afford the opportunity for the best people to fill those roles. And America is a great example of that working incredibly well. Ukraine is a great example of that working incredibly well.
How is it good for society? Society we're talking about.
It defends society when you have a better military. I guarantee you.
Is it better military?
Feminism in America has allowed us to build a military.
Wrap it up, brother.
It's unbelievable.
Well, he keeps getting interrupted, so it does make it longer, and then I can't say anything because you've already interrupted him 20 times. So,
well, you could just tell them to stop interrupting, right? Like if men are supposed to be the calm ones, it's a little insane that the people who are interrupting the least are the two women on the panel.
More meta. You're really good at meta.
Okay. All right.
You seem very afraid of it, Jim Bob. So
pretty much all you do.
I cannot.
I answer your questions,
Jim Bob. I cannot ask him to land his plane because you have interrupted him 5 times. If you let me see my way in, I can, but you keep interrupting, so I have to let him continue. Ken, if you could land the plane, that would be great. Thank you.
Societies that embrace feminism, which allows the best people
look at
in
these
those
donos.
societies.
Look at the money they're spending. Okay.
To achieve
I need some donos.
to fill those roles are better than societies that don't. And the proof is in how you match up these militaries. The ones that have a feminist basis crush the ones that don't every time.
Wait, what? You're saying that feminism is good for societies because the military with more women crush the all men militaries? Is that what you're saying?
The militaries that provide fair opportunities for people to fill those roles based on merit and talent are better militaries.
Okay, so you're just pointing to the fairness aspect, not the performance aspect.
What?
Well, fairness leads to the standards are kept, and
they are.
The opportunity is afforded to men and women alike. And if you achieve the standard, you get the best people out of society that way.
I'm going to start working on
So if I'm in a trench with a choice of 3 men or 3 women, you're saying I could choose either?
I think a cockpit is probably a better analogy, but sure, right. If they meet the standard.
No, it's not a better analogy because you have to be able to carry people out of war zones. You have to be able to do all sorts of physical labor inside of a war zone. We're not talking about flying a cockpit or flying a drone from Burbank, California.
Sure we are.
Right?
That's modern warfare. That's absolutely how wars are fought these days. And maybe if you listen a little more, you'd learn that. But when you afford women the opportunity to apply for those roles, you get the best people, and that makes society stronger.
How does it make society stronger?
Because when there's more people competing, there's more meritocracy.
Society in order to strengthen it.
Wait, what? But no, that doesn't tell me how it makes society stronger.
Do you not think that meritocracy is good, Jim Bob?
Military strengthens society because it protects society.
Well, no, you can have a strong military to protect a really shitty, broken society. That doesn't even follow.
Sure, but you can't have a society that is strong that cannot defend itself.
Right. And that goes to our point. You can't defend yourself without wholly dependent on men. In other words, if you swapped all the men in the IDF, there's 65% men in the IDF and the rest is women and probably some ambiguity in between. So if you wouldn't swap them with women and say, oh, it's no problem, right?
Yeah, well, I think you're misunderstanding the argument that feminism makes. You're assuming it's arguing for a full replacement of men, or even
I didn't say
like
that.
parity,
Dude.
50-50
Stop.
men and women.
I didn't say
What
that.
it argues
I said
is that
stop.
women
Oh
are.
my gosh, dude, this filibustering is insane. You
The
just go on this.
interruptions are insane.
No, dude,
Do I get to make my point, or are you going to interrupt every single time?
No, you're talking.
Try to make my point.
Okay,
Dude,
all
you're
right,
talking like
all right,
700
all
words
right.
per my 30. That wasn't, you just straw man what I said. Okay?
Offer the clarification, Jim Bob.
I just basically said this, right? Isn't it the case that you couldn't? I didn't say you would or you should. I'm not saying you're thinking you should. I'm saying could you swap out all of the males from your view, all of the males in the army with women, and it would be equal?
Of course not, but that's not the argument
Why not?
feminism is making.
Well, I didn't say you're making any arguments. You
And
guys
why are you
actually don't
asking
have
about
any
this?
arguments.
Well, of course we have
So
arguments. The problem is that you won't
the-
answer
the
questions. You won't follow our line of dialogue. So, like,
working on
nobody
being
has ever
less white.
said
And you won't
that
even
all
admit it.
women
We're
militaries is what would be
We're
the best
dodging.
situation.
We're
That's not what
dodging.
feminism
We're
is saying. There's no dodging that's happened. Jimbo, the only
Yeah.
person who's refused to
We're
answer
getting-
questions is yourself, right? You
Yeah,
haven't
right.
even,
Yeah,
for
right.
example, established how feminism
Lady,
is
I
a
have the clips
hierarchy.
of you dodging questions.
How
okay? So
is,
look,
what is empowerment?
relevant?
You can't answer
how
that
is
question.
relevant? How is it relevant?
All of it is
This why
relevant.
it's relevant.
All of it can be
It's
relevant.
I'm telling you how it's relevant. Society requires law and order. A good society requires law and order. You guys agree? Law and order relies on predominantly men, okay? Women can't collectively defend their own rights, correct?
So who are you?
Who are you
Can
addressing?
women collectively defend their own rights, yes or no?
No, nobody is
seen funny
advocating for an
examples of that,
only
sure.
woman
What?
military.
What? Excuse me? You're both talking. One of you at a
No
time.
one is advocating for a women-only
That
military.
didn't answer my question. Let's go
It
to Ken,
absolutely
since you don't
answers
wanna
your
answer
question.
questions.
I'm sure there are
Ken,
plenty of examples of women.
Let's give me
advocating
one
for their
example
rights.
of a collective of women who either took rights from people or defended their own rights.
I don't know. The suffragette movement was pretty effective at,
Great. Yeah, let's get into this.
gaining their own at gaining
Oh,
their rights.
Really? Oh, really? Did they use force to do that, or did it require men to do that?
They actually used
Honestly,
force and
not
peaceful
an expert
protest.
on the suffragette movement.
No, it required men. And here's the other thing about the suffragettes, Ken. All of the women, the majority of the women, were actually against the suffragette movement. In fact, the suffragette movement actually thwarted the showing up of the women to vote against being able to get the vote. They actually shut them down. So not only are you ignorant to the suffragette movement, that it was primarily anti women voting, was against the movement. And in the end, guess what, Ken? Any policy you think is progress, you and ERUDITE think is progress, anything you find is progressive and feminist friendly relies wholly on a disparity between the obligations of men and women. What we're pointing to is you haven't presented one good thing for society from a feminist view.
That's because you haven't listened to a word we've said.
You said
I
the
think we've made
military.
a
No, I
pretty
debunked
compelling
you.
Wait,
point.
hold on. We've established multiple things, right? I
give me
started this
one,
out.
Meredith.
Yeah, I gave you one immediately, which I said the innovation
What?
scale. It increases the innovation scale by 50%, which is good for GDP.
The innovation.
Yeah, but this is
scale?
just a graph go up. This is just a graph go up argument, ERUDITE. And if you don't actually have a labor force, if you have a declining birth rate, then you actually can't develop a labor force, and you've got to bring it all in from the third world.
So I'm super curious, Jake. Do you think that America would be nearly as dominant if it didn't allow women into its workforce?
Do you think it would be nearly as dominant? Yeah, I think it would.
You think
I
that if it was
just as
only
dominant
men and
before.
every other country allowed women in, but we didn't, that we would be the dominant hegemonic global force?
Oh, there would probably be some sort of a social restructuring. It couldn't just happen overnight. I mean, women are so deeply embedded into the labor force right now and into the workforce that it wouldn't be able to happen overnight.
So let's say we can go back in time in the 60s, right? When women are first starting to enter the workforce, 40s to 60s. Do you think that China would have been able to outcompeted us when it allowed women in if we refused to?
What do you mean?
Do you think that the GDP of America would have rose as aggressively and competitively without 50% of a labor infusion if every other country was infusing that labor into its workforce?
Maybe. I'm not too sure.
You really think that if we just didn't
you
allow
know that?
50% of our workforce, that we would somehow America would be the global hegemon? How?
Asking him a question
We
and
don't
being
really know that.
incredulous about the question isn't an argument. You're just basically
You
arguing
know what? You're
from-
right,
from
Jim Bob.
incredulity.
I don't need to make an argument against
you're
that.
just
Jake made it
arguing-
himself.
All you do is
I
this is what
think,
you do.
Jim Bob,
You don't really
I
think. You don't really think that, right? That's not an argument, okay? Are you
it's
making
just
an
a
affirmative
style.
claim?
Hold on, Jim Bob. I think it's just a style of speaking, the way she's asking questions. It would be it's the same way you're asking questions. She's just formulating them differently. That's all. That's all.
Yeah, I'd like to hear the argument though. What do you think? Do you think that it wouldn't have?
Yeah, I think with not allowing 50% of an increase in global workforce compared to every other country allowing that 50% increase, America would have been decimated. There's no world that we would have competed in any way GDP if we had 50% less of a labor workforce than every other country. That would be really bad.
Yeah, I mean, but like you look at it right now, and the birth rate is plummeting to the ground, and you've got to import the entire third world in order to actually sustain your labor market. You
Yeah,
see
I mean,
this
I think
in
that's
Canada, where you're from, ERUDITE.
Sure, that's bad though, right? You and I can both agree that declining birth rates is bad. That has nothing to do with my argumentation that
exactly.
women
But
entering the
but that
workforce
has a lot
was good
to do
for
with feminism,
GDP.
though.
Yeah, but this is
Yeah, but
you're
this
not
has a lot to do with feminism.
sure. So we can go into that separately, but first we have to tackle the GDP question. So do you have any other reason as to why women entering the workforce isn't good for GDP? Or do you agree with
look,
me? Do you
Well, yes.
hold on, Jim Bob?
What
Hold on, Jim Bob.
The
Let
debt-
Jake
the
answer.
debt
He can
for
do it.
women went up,
Or
right,
not.
dude? Look, no, this is a debate, okay? So, not so erudite. When you shove all the women under the guise of liberation from the home into the workforce, what does it do? It saturates the work market. It actually shows a trend of the amount of pay that everyone gets and goes down because you're just throwing the women out of the home, right? Their obligations is no longer to raise children, have children, make good humans for the next generation. It's to go chase shit. And what happens is you just load all of the people in, right? And then what do we have now? We have a saturated market that you call a really great workforce, right?
Yeah,
No,
I
it's
think the
not.
American GDP workforce is incredible.
Who cares what you think?
Sorry.
It doesn't matter because if
every
you
single
saturate-
respected economist, every single geopolitical leader, every single person in the entire world would agree that the American
And they're all in
GDP
debt, right?
is
It's great and
incredible.
they're all in debt.
Okay, I guess
Right,
maybe
and
you don't
everyone's in
like
debt.
America. I think America is incredible.
So
I
are
think
you
its
in
GDP
debt?
is impressive.
Are you in debt?
Yes, it's also in debt, and that has nothing
you
to
in
do with
debt?
its GDP.
Are you in debt?
No, I am not in debt.
Okay, so when you look at women who go through college and then they're all in debt, and you're like,
Sorry, what does this have to do with
kick-ass.
anything? What does this have to do with
It has to
anything?
do what is the topic of the debate?
Well, it
there,
feels like you're
Erudite?
dodging my GDP argumentation to just move into debt
Yeah,
because you
you're
can't
pointing
handle
to
it.
One thing that you can look at the number and say that good, and we're not talking.
Well, you can't
about the
establish why
society
it's
on
not
economics.
good, right?
What can you manipulate the GDP? Can it be other variables? Could you possibly know all the variables that contribute to the GDP?
Yeah, there are other
You
factors.
could? You know all of them? You know all of them?
I don't know all of them
Okay,
off of the
cool.
top of my
So-
head. Do you know
so-
all of them?
So what is it better for
Jim Bob,
the
do you know
GDP
all
to-
of the factors that
I'm
contribute to
asking you a
GDP?
question. No, you're
Oh,
the one making
okay.
the claim. So
I'm not making a
you're the
claim
one
that I
making
know
this claim.
everything about the
This is-
GDP.
this is
I'm
the-
saying that
this
when
is what
women enter the
happens in this
workforce and you
world.
increase the workforce by 50%, it increases your GDP. This is obvious, right?
Yeah, who cares if everyone's in debt
Well-
and they get paid shit?
well-
what's the point?
Debt is a tool, right? The issue with like modern.
I didn't ask you what you think debt is.
Well,
said,
I didn't say what I
good is it
think
for
debt is. I
society?
said what debt is. Debt is a tool, right? So while I agree that, for example, the fact that we're paying more interest payments than we are for like buying into our military is really bad, debt in and of itself isn't bad, and GDP isn't really in
Has
relationship to
debt
this.
gone up since?
So has our
debt? Yes or no? Yes or no? Has debt gone up for women since they entered the workforce?
yeah, probably.
Okay, cool. Is that good?
It's neutral. Debt is neutral. It can
Oh,
be
it's
bad and it
neutral.
can
It's-
be
it's
bad.
totally neutral being in
Yes,
debt and not
debt is
being able to
typically
afford
neutral. So,
anything,
for
right?
example,
Okay, cool.
maybe I could outline this to you. So, one of the reasons why debt can be really beneficial, for example, is in an era of inflation. So, when inflation happens, every single dollar is worth less, like tomorrow and the next year, which is why if you have $1,000 of debt right now, a year from now, that $1,000 of debt is literally worth less, which is why the richest people on the planet, like Elon Musk and whatnot, constantly work through debt. They consolidate debt, they move it between accounts, but debt is absolutely a way
Usually
that you
good.
manage money and income. I didn't say debt is all
Usually
good.
good.
I said debt can be good.
It can be good. Can debt be really bad too? Or
Yeah, of
no?
course.
You said it's neutral, so now you're in a contradiction.
No, I said debt is a
You said
tool.
neutral.
It's neutral.
debt
It
is
can be.
neutral.
No, I said it's neutral, which means it can be good and it can be bad.
No, that
So-
would mean it's neither good or bad.
Yeah.
So I guess we can get semantics. I'll update my statement. Sure.
Semantics on what the word neutral means?
Debt is a tool, is what I initially said. The debt as a tool can be used for good things, and it can be used for bad things, and it can be used for neutral things.
Okay, so how is it good to advocate for women to, let's say, not stay in the home and have children, and instead acquire debt through some shitty social science and go get a job while they're in debt and they can barely afford to even make it to work, let alone their bills and their car payments? Why is that good? As opposed to our stance is, women shouldn't go out into the workforce. We should prioritize a high level funded campaign to get women to have children and to build the next generations of humans. You're arguing, well, there's no obligation, right? Either way, there's no obligation. We're asking you, why is it good why is feminism good in this particular instance where I'm arguing, Jake and I are arguing, no, don't advocate for women. Actually advocate against it. The ones who break through, fine. If you want to work that bad, great. But at least advocate for women to stay in the home, get married, have children for the next generation. That's going to be more fruitful than them acquiring debt and earning a badge and a cute card for the company they work for. But you're arguing, are you arguing one or the other in this position? I actually don't even know.
Well, it's kind of, you probably should know, because I've said it a number of times. I think part of the problem is now you're doing the Mott and Bailey thing again. So now you're saying feminism is when, we call each other out on their fallacies. We've done it a number of times, right? It's okay. If you define feminism as women have debt and not kids, then that version of whatever you're calling feminism, I would agree is not good. However, nobody defines feminism that way, right? I offered us a definition of feminism as empowering women, right? I think feminism. Tell me what empowering is. Well, you also couldn't tell me what empowering is. And then I answered, Jim Bob, pause, breathe, you can do it. I also answered the question and I said, empowerment is giving people choice, which is what Christ does for us. That's when we say that Christ has empowered us. It means that we have free will for salvation. We can choose him or not choose him.
Is Christ a patriarchy?
What?
Is Christianity a patriarchy?
Broadly, yeah.
Christ right now.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you want a Christian nation then?
I don't believe that Christianity should be blended with politics, no.
Oh, so you don't think my Christian view should inform my view on, say, abortion?
No, it should, absolutely, as a voter. I just don't think... it's not a contradiction, right? There's a pretty...
contradicted yourself.
It's not a contradiction. I can outline why it's not a contradiction if you'd like.
So premise one, I don't think you should...
Do you want me to outline why it's not a contradiction?
Also, premise two, you should have your theology inform your view on politics.
Okay, so I know you really like wandering around because you really didn't like the GDP argument. So I will pick us back up because we need to go back to the GDP argument because you claimed that we didn't have any argument for how feminism is good. And I argued that the reason why feminism good is in one standard that it raises GDP by allowing women to enter the workforce, which I think is good for society, right? So we can go back to the whatever you're trying to claim is a contradiction, whatever.
Christianity. Let's stay right with Christianity.
You're the one wandering and running away from the GDP conversation.
I didn't wander. You did. Just said Christianity.
When I talked about GDP, you switched it all of a sudden to debt. And then when we were talking more about debt, then you switched it to how I couldn't answer about empowerment. And then I outlined how Christianity talks about empowerment. And now we're talking about Christianity but I would like to talk about GDP. Do you want to talk about GDP?
No, Christianity also talks about patriarchy, but now you're like, well,
sure, I agree. That's just not the point, right? If you want to talk about what we're here to talk about,
you just rambled a bunch.
Let's pick one or the other. Christianity in terms of empowerment or Christianity in terms of patriarchy, either one. I see that it comes from both sides there, so let's pick one and go.
Well, why don't we talk about GDP? If we want to go back to the actual topic, which is this feminism good for society, then contend with my argument that feminism allows women to choose to enter the workforce, which increases our GDP dramatically by having a 50% infusion of workforce.
Who gives a shit if everyone's in debt and can't afford their bills?
Right. And so then I outlined to you how debt is a tool. Do you have a rebuttal for how debt is not a tool?
It's a tool. If people can't afford, right? If you flood the market with people getting all after the same jobs, what happens to the payment of that job?
Well, initially you're going to have a wage drop and then a large amount of...
Has that happened since women have entered the workforce? Yes.
I believe initially there was a wage drop. And then what happened is that there were so many more workers that small business owners could suddenly afford to buy workers. And so more innovation occurred. This is why when we talk about the innovation scale that Ken was referencing, having more workers workers allows for more innovation scale. You have more people to pick from. It drives wages down. It allows people to afford workers more effectively. And now you have more industry, and suddenly you have more jobs and therefore more GDP. This is how workforce entering the labor pool increases GDP.
Okay, and that's good for a society that is lacking on children?
Well, these are two separate issues, right? GDP
No,
being
they're not.
good. Well,
They're not two separate issues.
You're not.
You think
two
that-
separate issues?
Because if
How
you're saying,
not?
if you're arguing feminism is good for X and X is good for flourishing, we're asking you long-term positions, right? Because if you're a feminist, which both of you are, you're making a worldview claim about not only now but the future, right? We're asking you from your worldview, which you're defending tonight, if feminism is good for society, how is it good for future generations if from both of your view you have no obligation to reproduce?
I mean, we can answer this in multiple ways, but GDP is still the answer. There's innovator scale, GDP, production labels,
Yeah, but Carla, what
freedom
do
of
you think
choice.
is better? Do you think it's better if the marketplace and the workforce is entirely flooded with women? If you take it to either of the maxims, if women are just in the workforce 100%, or if women are 100% making babies, what do you think is better for a long-term thriving society?
This is what Jim Bob already asked me. It's a mutual exclusive, improbable reality. Broadly, what's better
It's just taking
long
it to its
term?
logical maxim.
Well, the issue is that feminism is saying that only women should only do work. They should say fourth wave feminism, for example, is very pro-mom. Well, branches of it. And then there's some antinatalists, but I hate the antinatalists, just to be clear.
But what do you think the answer to the question is, though? If we had to go in one direction or the other, do you
already
think it's
answered it.
better fluffy notepads and emails, or do you think it's better families and children?
I already answered it. I already said, of course, you need families and birth rate to continue. The issue is that you're creating
Okay.
hold on, you're creating a false dichotomy, right? These
So graph go
these
up.
things,
Yeah.
no, well, the graph goes up is important when understanding GDP. This doesn't happen in a
But it's not
vacuum.
long term. It's not sustainable.
Well, women can enter the workforce and have children, right?
But they end up leaving,
They can
right?
do.
Yeah, of course they
If
can.
they hand their kids
That's
off to the
good.
state, sure they can do. Yeah. But in terms of the long term, this is a rather new experiment that we've run here in terms of the graph go up that you're talking about. Yes, for the short term, you could argue that it does make the GDP go up, but how's that actually good for society in the long term? That's what we want to know.
Well, a whole bunch of reasons. Strong GDP is really good for a nation for a number of reasons. First of all, it increases jobs, so everyone has more jobs. It increases global wealth of that country. GDP is also incredibly, incredibly important for soft power negotiations at a geopolitical level. So if you don't have a strong GDP as a country, your trade routes are harder. You're going to get tariffed more. You're going to get into trouble more in trades. And so your soft power negotiation skills with foreign groups, particularly hostile ones, is vastly decreased if you don't have the GDP to compete with them. So here's a false dichotomy, but hypothetical. Do you think a society that has 0% women in the workforce is better than a society that allows women to be in or out of the workforce? Would it be better
Yes.
if there's no women in the workforce? Jim Bob says
in the
yes.
long- in the
It'd
long
be better than
term,
what we have today. Yeah.
Yeah, well, in the long term, yes.
So then why is Afghanistan such a
Wow.
shit country?
Because
Because
cool red herring. So
It's not a red herring.
First of all,
There's no
you
women in the
can't- you
workforce.
can't just- No, stop. So does Afghanistan are they also informed by a worldview?
Yeah, they have a theocracy.
Okay, cool. So are we Islam? Are you arguing with Islamicists right now, or erudite? Or are you just
No, I'm
you're
arguing
just
with somebody-
this dishonest? Are you this dishonest?
This isn't dishonest, Jim Bob. So the reason
Yes,
why
it
this is analogous,
Yes, oh, sweetie, don't give me that fucking phone. Look, you just said.
you're okay, Jim Bob.
What happened to this other country acting like you're basically just argued from this position that look at this other country that has all these other variables and look what turned out for them, as if we're holding that position. It's
Can
just
you
dishonest.
find me any single country that exists right now or historically where women were absolutely not allowed in the workforce and the country was
Nobody's
better and more
arguing that they
competitive
shouldn't be
as a result of
allowed.
it?
Dude, you're so dishonest. We didn't say they shouldn't be allowed. Okay, another slip from your little fork tongue. We said it's better if they don't. Is that the same as they shouldn't be allowed?
Oh, so you would say that
Answer
it's
the
not.
question.
So you
No,
would say it's
answer
a
the question.
No, I didn't
Is
say
it the
this.
same? Can you answer any questions? Is
I
it
have
the
answered
same?
all of your
He
questions,
hasn't
Jim
been
Bob.
fair or
It's
honest,
one
don't
yes or no
stop.
question.
I've answered
Is
all of
me
your
say-
questions,
is
Jim Bob.
me s- Oh, it's a yes or no question. Let's see if you can do it. When I say it's better to have women out of the workforce and at the home, is that the same statement as they shouldn't be allowed to work?
No, it says just false. So hold on. We can back you up. Do you want me to walk you through again? I can hold your hand, Jim Bob. Why did I use the false dichotomy?
No, what you did, ERUDITE, was you asked a hypothetical, and then we answered the hypothetical, and then you said, well, that's what you guys must think. But actually, it doesn't account for the
That's not what I did. What I actually did, so Jake, I can outline to what I did. So you guys asked me a false dichotomy where you created two things that were mutually exclusive and wouldn't be allowed to exist together. Where you said women at home or women in the workforce not having children. And I said, well, that's really, these things are not mutually exclusive. So
and
what
then
I
you
did,
said women at home, and I didn't say, oh, well, you think that all women should be at home.
Well, what I did instead is I gave you a question where I made two things that are obviously stupid to pretend that they're mutually exclusive, and then you answered, these things aren't mutually exclusive, which obviously is true, which is what my original answer was to whether they should stay at home or go to work. My answer would be they should probably do both as they like. Right?
Why are priorities?
Okay, let me give you the real story. I'll give you the real story of what just happened, ERUDITE.
Sure.
We asked a hypothetical, and we said, well, if you take it to its maximum, would it be better if women were just staying at home, or if women were just flooding the workforce and being wage slaves? You said staying at home. We said sure. Then we developed the argument. We could have said, okay, well, ERUDITE, you think that women should all just stay at home. Why do you think where are all women just staying at home? We could have done that, but that's exactly what you did with your hypothetical. You asked us an unrealistic hypothetical, and then you claimed that that was our position. That was what you did.
So what I did is I took your argument, which is that women shouldn't be in the workforce, and I took it to its maximum, which would be 0% of women in the workforce. And I asked you to give me an example of a country, for example, that is stronger as a result of having 0% of women in the workforce.
Before we flooded the women in the workforce, that was a pretty good time in America. Before we thought, oh, feminism, let's just flood society. Let's give women the vote, first of all. Like against their will, by the way, predominantly their will. They were like, no, we don't want this. We won't. This is a threat to how we live. This is a threat to our values. No, just trump those people, step over them, and give the women the right to vote, and then vote for all these policies, right, that are actually end up hurting families and women, right, on net balance. Like they're not good. Like feminism as a net balance is not good for society. And the only counters you guys gave so far is my GDP, and I fought along some really brute IDF soldiers.
Well, GDP, really innovation scale, luggage. Right? We also said innovation scale, and then greater freedoms and rights leads to flourishing. So one question that I actually have for either of you two, was America stronger before or after World War II?
Stronger in what sense? This is like
the GDP, the country. Well, in the way that we usually mean it. Was it a global hegemonic country?
Before when?
Before and after World War II. Was it stronger before or after World War II?
Well, we were strong in the sense that we still made stuff inside the country.
That's not an answer to my question, Jim Bob.
Yeah, it is. It's an aspect of strength. Another aspect of strength.
Was it stronger before or after?
Let me answer your question.
Okay.
Okay. Keep the slithering tongue in your mouth for a second. So families were more together. People were married for longer at that time, right? So that the actual foundation of a society is what Jake and I are arguing. You're looking at particular things you like, right? We're looking at the foundation. This is our argument against feminism. You guys don't look at foundations. You just look at the topical things you like as a result, right?
I'm talking about global power, right? That's what I'm interested in, is global power.
What good is a global power for a country whose homes are completely dismantled?
Well, for one thing, they can at least rebuild their homes rather than be invaded by all neighboring countries.
Families? Homes, you mean families?
Sure, yeah. I use the word you use, but yeah, of course.
So is feminism, do you think feminism is in more support of the traditional family or less in support?
I think most feminists would be against right now. There's a lot of antinatalists. I just think that that's bad. I think that's a bad part of feminism. But that's not a part I own.
Okay, so you split yourself up in the feminist view and you say there's a feminist who went too far. Here's some feminists that didn't go too far.
Just like how there's Christian denominations, right? We don't all agree with necessarily.
I understand. But what we're saying is that feminism, the view itself, is a movement away from a patriarchal system.
I would, yes, for the most part.
Is that
good? Yep. It's not the worst thing necessarily.
I didn't say if it's a worst thing. I said, is it a good thing?
It's neutral.
It's a neutral thing. What's the topic of the debate?
Feminism is good for society. You're talking about, okay, you're doing the switch again. Okay, what you're doing again is you're talking about a hierarchical system, and you're conflating that with feminism. Feminism isn't a hierarchical system. You can talk about matriarchies if you want to. I think you and I would agree about matriarchies, for example, that by and large they're not a very strong strategic competition. That's why matriarchies dominantly didn't rise and patriarchies did.
One claim at a time. You said feminism's not a hierarchical system. Is it better or worse for a society to have a hierarchical system to keep it in order?
It's fundamental to a society. You need a hierarchy.
It's fundamental to a society for a hierarchy to exist.
True.
Feminism doesn't provide a hierarchy. Is it better to choose between the two? Of a system that has a hierarchy, being that it's necessary for its foundation, and feminism not having the necessary foundations for a society.
I'd love to jump in and
no, don't save her.
Stop, Jim
I
Bob.
can assure you, he was not
Earlier
saving me. You're doing
Jake.
another false dichotomy.
Hold on. You jumped in for Jake earlier when
Now
she
you're
asked
saving.
Jake
Now
her
you're
question.
saving, moderator. You're saving now. This is what happens when you put women in power. This is exactly what happens.
Stop it.
Save everything turns into a fucking daycare center.
Well, let me change
debate.
your diaper, Jim Bob. Stop it. You jumped in on a question she asked Jake earlier, so I think it's
I
fair
just
for him
got her
to-
in a corner and he saved her. And you're
You
like,
did not
yeah,
get me in a
let him
corner.
let him save her.
Tell you what, we'll put Jim Bob. We'll put a pin in it. You can
Yeah.
re-ask me afterwards, okay? But it's fair to let Ken and Jake jump in. I promise you can ask me your false dichotomy afterwards as well. I promise.
Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, no. Look, I just want my time to be valuable here. I've been here for an hour and a half, and would love to get a word in edgewise with Jim Bob interrupting constantly. The answer to the question about hierarchy. Sorry, what was that, Jim Bob?
I said cry harder.
What does that mean?
Just keep going with the question, bro.
Just make.
I think Jim Bob is treating this like a therapy session. He forgets that we're in a debate, so he's been very emotional. So he's making a safe space for your emotions now, Ken, which is really nice of you,
Go
Jim.
ahead
I
with
appreciate
your
that.
thoughts, Ken.
Yeah, feminism does introduce a hierarchy of merit, not of gender or anything else, but feminism allows the best in a society to reach their potential and to fill those roles, whether they're in the military or in research or any of those things, which in a society that embraces feminism, they do better at. And study after study establishes this, whether it's the OECD study in 2015 or the constant reports from the UN on societies that embrace this kind of equality versus those that don't. Feminism is a hierarchy of merit, and that makes society stronger.
Well,
So you think that that men and women are equal then, Ken?
No.
No? You think that in a military sense that men and women are equal?
No.
No? So then you're always going to need the enforcement arm of men?
Better than men in some areas of the military, much better. They're way better
Such as?
at
nurses?
checkpoints in Afghanistan. Like, it is impossible for a male to manage a voting booth that is reserved for women in Afghanistan. You can't provide security for that as a male in Afghanistan. You can as a woman because of the culture.
So women are better at organizing women at a voting booth in the military?
No, they're better given that cultural setting in doing searches for suicide vests.
How?
Because if a man tries to do it, they'll be shot.
What?
So in the context of Afghanistan, why would a man be shot for doing that?
You know the answer, right? It's the cultural mores. Only
Because if a
women
man can't touch a woman? What?
That's right.
So then, but why would who would shoot him?
The Taliban. I mean, do we need to explain this?
Oh, so you're talking about the Afghani military.
Such a boomer.
Sorry, what was that?
So you're talking about the Afghani.
No,
you're
Jim
talking
Bob.
about the Afghani military.
Was that a question, Jim Bob?
No, I just called you a boomer.
Okay.
A boomer. So you're talking about the Afghani military.
No, I'm talking about the U.S. military. We have plenty of.
So the U.S. military are going to shoot each other?
No. Not the Afghan military. The insurgents in Afghanistan would shoot the U.S. But I can give you other examples of where.
What kind of an incompetent military would allow them their soldiers to get shot in that situation? Wouldn't you protect them from that?
I don't know. It happens all the time. It doesn't mean the U.S. military is incompetent.
So what, you've got some jihadis standing over them, watching the vest being searched? I'm confused.
Yeah, it happens all the time. It's called a green on blue. And if you provoke the cultural sensibilities in that area, there are flare-ups, even within supposed friendlies. But there are plenty of other examples of jobs that women are better at, right? I just gave you one of them, but there are plenty of other examples of jobs that women are better at. And what feminism does is it introduces that hierarchy of merit. Just invented that term trying to answer Jim Bob's question, but it's a hierarchy of merit that allows the best people in a society to do those jobs. And sometimes they are women.
How does feminism do that?
But the hierarchy of merit is always going to require males to enforce this hierarchy.
That's a supposition I don't buy into at all. I mean,
how many Navy SEALs are women?
You'd be surprised at how many women serve alongside Navy SEAls that don't get to be called Navy SEAls.
That's not what he asked.
Look, you're playing semantics because for all intents and purposes, there are women in the SEAL teams that you've never heard of.
Answer the question.
I don't know the exact
How many Navy
number,
SEAls are women?
There are women serving in SEAL teams right now that the SEAL
the answer is zero.
That's not true. That they couldn't do their mission without those women.
That's
just because you don't know about it doesn't make it not make it.
Like you don't know about it either. You're just making it up. You're literally making
I'm
shit
not.
Up.
Wait, who served in the military here?
I'm just war about a woman who served with the Navy SEAls in Afghanistan.
As a Navy SEAL?
Just a quick question. Who here served in the military before?
Navy SEAls doing everything they did.
Can I just?
I think only Ken, right? Was Ken? Did you guys serve in the military? Just super quickly.
I said.
Have you guys served in the military?
I said that there was a hierarchy and that the male enforcement is required in that hierarchy. You said you don't accept my presupposition. I said how many Navy SEAls are women? The answer is zero. So therefore, that is a merit-based system. That is a merit-based system, and the males are required to do that because the women can't meet the merit-based criteria.
Women serve with Navy SEAls meeting those criteria.
They probably make them sandwiches.
For legal reasons, they're not allowed to be called Navy SEAls, so it becomes a word game.
Wait, no. You're saying that women actually meet the testing standards that are current for men, Navy SEAls, but they just don't call them that for some cultural reason? Is that what you're saying?
That's right. It's illegal for women to be Navy SEAls. That is a legal restriction, not a merit-based restriction.
Ooh.
Really? Because they can pass those tests. Hmm?
Have you served in the military, Jim Bob?
I
would you know?
I had a Navy person on this debate to be able to answer this for
me. Anyone would be better than you.
Well, he's at least served in the military, right? You're like talking to a vet. So it's just to be clear, like I'm just a little surprised by the level of disrespect you guys are having for a vet.
That's a cool emotion. That's a great emotion.
Well, you've had a lot of emotions, Jim Bob, so it's my time. You know, it's my time as a woman.
Enough.
Well, you've had a lot of emotions. You're very angry.
Emotional,
very red.
This is what women do. That's all you got is like, I'm going to tone police and I'm going to be really surprised about
and answer all your questions on GDP.
I can't believe you threw your Legos.
And explain what debt does.
Be a mom. Go be a mom.
And explain how empowerment works. Yep.
You're better used as a mom.
So just a quick question. Have either of you guys served in the military? Or is it just Ken?
No, but it's collectively men. It doesn't matter.
But you didn't serve in the military.
Well, the military.
It's just not a
men.
No, I'm just establishing that fact.
That it's
that you guys haven't served in the military and Ken has. That's all I'm establishing.
It's like me arguing with an American about politics and then them saying to me, "Well, are you American? Are you American? Do you live in America?"
That's just
and it doesn't matter because we can just look at the facts. It's just not a good argument.
I guess the larger point, Jake, is that you're claiming to be an expert on something. And dismissing the actual.
When did I claim that?
What? You're just a liar. When did he claim to be an expert?
When did I claim that?
Well, you're asserting these things about the Navy SEAls as if they're true, and then when you're faced with actual facts, you move right on and pretend that that you know.
I haven't heard the facts. Maybe I missed that part. Maybe I missed the facts.
I heard the anecdotal stories about women moving bags at the airport, but we didn't hear any actual arguments from you guys.
Jim Bob, super curious. Have you been a police officer before?
No, I haven't.
Oh, so how come you haven't met any of your obligations as a man?
Sweetie, how is that relevant?
I'm just curious. I'm just curious. Well, I'm curious what your reasons would be for not meeting that obligation.
Could you could you tie this into why feminism is good for society, sweetie?
Well, we can go back if you want to talk about GDP again, but I know that one's a really spooky topic for you.
No. Just in general, how is your questioning of whether or not I've ever been a police officer relevant to your?
I'm just shocked shocked you have to dither on it. I figured I would get a straight answer really clearly. You were big about obligations and men's obligations.
Why would that be relevant?
Why would lots of the stuff that you've brought up be relevant? But I was curious.
Stuff be relevant to me not answering?
I thought you could answer questions. You know, you've been dogging on me for not answering them. I figured you could answer some.
Nor did I ever set myself on the path. How is it relevant now?
I'm just wondering why you haven't fulfilled your obligations as a man to being a police officer or a military arm.
Become a police officer, silly.
Or military. You've got to be the arm of enforcement, right?
No one.
That's your obligation.
That you have an obligation to join the military.
Oh, so men don't have an obligation to join the military?
No. The men, as a collective, not as individuals, as a collective, it's required that men, if they want an ordered society, there has to be an obligation for men to fulfill their obligations as the arm of force.
So why don't you?
Otherwise, you don't. Hold on. Otherwise, you don't have an ordered society. Now, feminism doesn't have any obligations.
So other men have the obligation, but you don't have the obligation.
The ones who,
and they do that as well.
I haven't look.
Well, I respect our vets and our police officers. I think it's great. I'm just curious why Jim Bob isn't fulfilling his obligations there.
I have an obligation to conceal carry.
You have an obligation to conceal carry.
Yes.
Why? Where's that obligation come from?
From my work, from my view, I have an obligation to protect myself and my family. And my house is a mini state. And this is a great point, actually. I'm glad you asked it, because from a feminist view, you guys have no obligation of what the home is or isn't, right? From my view, my home is actually an extension of what I'm arguing for the state, which is a patriarchal system. So even if I'm not a cop, even if I'm not a priest, I'm a priest of my home and I'm a cop of my home. The home is a patriarchal system. From your view, and Ken here, who knows, he probably votes with his wife who's gonna get the say every week, every other week, who gets the man pants, right? From our view, it's more effective for the men to lead both in and outside of the home. So when you ask notsoErudite, are you a police officer? I'm a police officer of my home. Are you a priest? I'm a priest of my home.
In the way that the women are Navy SEALs, but not a name. I get you.
You have no leadership. You and Ken have zero obligations for any sort of ordered system to be patriarchal, yet you rely wholly on patriarchal systems.
We have all sorts of obligations that we establish, right? We talked about the social contract. So I guess the reason why I'm bringing this up is if men are not obligated to join the military, as you yourself said, but some men do, then men are not the enforcement arm. Soldiers and police officers are.
That doesn't even follow. What's wrong with your brain? You shouldn't even get a vote.
Say it again.
You just said,
if you want me to.
Because all men don't join the military, that means that the military isn't predominantly men.
That's not what I said. That's not what I said.
Yeah, it is.
Nope.
Say it again.
Okay. If men are not obligated, I wrote it down just for you. If men are not obligated to join the military, but some men do, then men are not the enforcement arm. Soldiers are, and police officers are. Yeah, of course.
If there is an enforcement arm at all, that's useful and effective, it's predominantly men, and you can't give me any sort of counter to that.
I've never ever been offered to. The issue is that it's not men that are the enforcement arm; it's soldiers.
It is men predominantly who are the enforcement arm.
That doesn't matter.
Both Ken agrees.
That doesn't matter.
Tell me where there's an enforcement arm, ERUDITE, where it's predominantly women, please.
I don't need to.
You just made the claim.
I did never make the claim. I said if men are not obligated, I'll say it again. If men are not obligated to join the military, but some men do, then men are not the enforcement arm. Soldiers and police officers are the enforcement arm. Predominant isn't an operative in this discussion.
Are they collectively men? Man is a status of sex, right? It doesn't follow that because the
patriarchy doesn't mean men are most soldiers. That's not what patriarchy means.
Lady, because the predominant sex in the military, in the enforcement arm of a society is men, it doesn't follow that because some men aren't in that role, that it's not predominantly men. What is wrong with your brain?
Because predominant isn't an operative in this discussion. Nobody's disagreed about predominant. What we're talking about,
you just contradict yourself.
No, because you said that a patriarchy is that men are the enforcement arm of the patriarchy. However, men are not obligated to join the military, but some men do. Then men are not the enforcement arm. Soldiers are the enforcement arm.
I think they should. I think they should be obligated to join the military.
Then why didn't you?
It's not anything against my point. The point is, and this is something you guys can't really grapple with, is if a bunch of men want to take the rights of anybody else, right? If a collective of men want to do that, they can do that. If a collective of women want to do that, they can't. Silence.
I'm unsure how to explain to you more clearly that your definition of patriarchy isn't what anyone uses.
I didn't talk about definitions. What did I just say?
You've defined from you lost your own point. You're lost in your own plot.
You disagree with what I just said?
No. So
okay,
hold
great.
on.
So if you don't disagree with what I just said, and I'll say it again for the audience, a collective of men could get together and completely wither away your so-called rights to vote and your loud mouth and everything you have that comes with you. Okay, they could just do that, right? But a collective
soldiers
of
could,
women,
yeah.
But a collective of women couldn't.
The main thing that's important here is, I guess I'll explain it to your chat, is that Jim Bob has conceded his main point, which is that men aren't the enforcement arm. It's soldiers that are the enforcement arm. A patriarchy is not, no, it's dominantly men. That's not part of the contention. It's not men. It's not men that are the enforcement arm. It's soldiers, which you've agreed. No, it's soldiers, actually. It's soldiers and military officers, right?
He's not a man. He's a basketball player.
Again, soldiers. I know you can keep up, Jim Bob, right?
Yeah, but Jim Bob also made the argument that within his home, he also has duties, and his duties are to protect his home and to protect his family. So these are duties that extend outside of the military. It's not all just about military and police officers.
Well, for your definition of patriarchy, you're talking about the enforcement arm, which is about soldiers and police officers.
That goes to the home as well.
It goes to the home too. That's why
the enforcement.
That's why we're advocates for the family, and feminism is not.
Is patriarchy a hierarchical system of organizing a society?
Yes, it's the only one. It's the only possible one.
Sure. Okay. So if it's a system of organization of a society, you already said part of the foundations of a society is law enforcement, right? Law and structure.
Yeah, that's the second premise of my argument you guys couldn't engage with. Yes, go on.
Okay, so if men aren't the enforcement arm, it's soldiers and police officers, and not all soldiers are men, you've already sacrificed your definition of patriarchy.
No, unbelievable.
Yes, this is how your premises work.
I just want to clarify what ERUDITE is trying to do here. So she says, because
cosplaying as a police officer doesn't count, just like apparently Navy SEAL women don't count. Just to be clear.
Hold on a second. I know you want to try to take back your shitty argument, but let's give it back to the audience, okay? She said, because the enforcement arm is made up of soldiers who are predominantly male, it doesn't follow that the enforcement arm is predominantly male. That's literally what she said.
That's not what I've said. I, again, wrote it down. I can read it to you again, but we should probably move. I understand that you just cannot either follow. I don't understand. Just like,
you're roboting.
I get that you don't understand.
Roboting for anyone else?
No.
Nope, just you. I've already said a few times, we can move on. Do you guys want to deal with the GDP point? Because you guys still haven't tackled that yet. So again, if your definition of patriarchy is that men are the enforcement arm, but men don't have to be soldiers and not all soldiers are men, then men are not the enforcement arm. Soldiers and police officers are. The predominant claim has nothing to do with it.
What are the sex of the predominant officers and soldiers?
Nobody's fought you on that the entire time. So that doesn't make men the enforcement arm.
Are you having an aneurysm?
I guess I don't know what to tell you other than maybe if you go back to your Andrew Wilson Debate University, they can walk you through how premises work. Premise 1, 2, and 3 leads to a resolution. And that might help you. I don't know what else to tell you here. I've walked you through the argumentation multiple times. I understand that you don't get it, mostly because you don't want to. But
you guys can look. I agree with a couple of your premises here. A good society requires law and order. Law and order requires the enforcement of men, or what you call soldiers or police officers, right? It's the uniforms that make it, not the men, not the brute force, right? It's not the actual muscle and bone thickness and aggression of men. It's just the uniform, right? Okay. Premise 3, a society that requires the force of men is patriarchal because ultimately the patriarchy, the collection of men, ERUDITE and Ken, could at any moment, tell me if you disagree with this, at any moment a collection of men in a society can take over and remove your so-called rights. Yes or no?
So what? Like, that doesn't
Is
mean
that a yes,
feminism is
Ken?
bad for
Hey,
society.
Ken, can you answer a question or not?
The argument is feminism bad for society? And it's
No, is it good? No, is it
Okay.
good for society?
The argument is feminism is good for society, which it is, because in every society where it's been able to take root, it's made those societies better.
That's just an assertion. Why don't you just assert your opening statement again without arguing it?
No. I've cited the OECD studies, the McKinsey studies. Innovation increases, GDP increases across every metric. Society does better economically in terms of security, innovation, when feminism is allowed to take root.
And then you guys get to pick and choose what types of feminist messaging you don't assign yourself to, right? Ambiguity.
Yeah, I get to define feminism.
Yeah, you get to just say, well, that feminist isn't real feminism. Like,
Yeah, just like you're redefining patriarchy to just be your own thing, right?
No,
which is this enforcement
is a system of a top-down system that at the top there are men, and that's exactly the society you live in.
Right, but you've also redefined it as men are the enforcement arm, which is what
that's included in a patriarchy. Otherwise, what are you talking about?
No, because there's lots of patriarchies, for example, that might just have exclusively slaves, men, women, children, doesn't matter.
That would require force of men, dummy. How do you hold slaves without the force of men, ERUDITE?
You can withhold their food. You control their mobility.
With force?
What?
With force or just with words?
With force eventually, but you can also do it by like withholding items,
Thanks for proving
building
my point.
structures.
Try again.
I don't actually think this argument is nearly as strong as you feel that it is. I understand that you feel really strongly that it is.
I don't care about your thoughts.
I'm talking about your feelings. I'm talking about your feelings, Jim Bob.
So can you keep slaves without force?
No, of course not.
Okay, cool. So that's a point in my direction. Would you like to move on to the next argument?
Sure. Do you want to engage with GDP now?
No. Who cares about the GDP?
That's part of my argument.
Why care about the GDP if feminism doesn't have an obligation to reproduce?
Again, we're going back to the obligation argument.
If GDP good,
Jim Bob,
GDP good, good.
You're going to be okay. If we go back to the obligation argument, you've already established that there are lots of things that men and women are not obligated to. Men are not obligated to be police officers or soldiers. Women are not obligated to reproduce. This has nothing to do with feminism and everything to do with, it has everything to do with a liberal democracy. We don't obligate people to do multiple things, including join the military, join the police.
Outlaw women voting?
Yeah, it could be voted for. And
is there an obligation to not outlaw women voting from a feminist view?
It would be opposed to a feminist view. I wouldn't say it's an obligation.
Yeah, but there's no obligation. It could, if you're really arguing for democracy, couldn't it be the case that we just vote out your power to vote?
Yes, you could vote out our power to vote.
Cool. So is that what's better for society, to have a system that you can vote out your power?
Yeah, I think democracy is better. And I think most societies that have democracy tend to give people the right to vote because in general, having greater levels of freedom, of choice and opportunity amongst all citizens leads to better GDP, which leads to better flourishing for the society.
Well, by society, you mean the people who aren't producing more people, right?
By society, I mean everyone who's a citizen within a nation.
Who exists, right? But then they die, and then what are you left with? Nothing, right?
Well, hopefully children are happening too.
Well, hopefully, but there's no obligation under feminism. So it's under feminism.
Well, there's no obligation anywhere, right? You're like, which government do you want to erect that's forcing women to have children?
Dude, lady, chill. So under feminism, you admitted that there is no obligation to reproduce.
Nope.
So in that regard,
under your system, is there an obligation to reproduce?
Yes, Christian.
How are you going to force that?
Enforce it? It's. I didn't say it had to be enforced.
Well, it's an obligation. So if you don't do it, obviously you're violating something. Well, he's saying it's an obligation, and I agree it's never been enforced. So how do you enforce it?
You probably wore a mask for like 19 months.
I didn't actually.
From shame, right?
Nope. Do you want to answer my question, or do you want to run away with COVID talks?
Well, I just answered your question, right?
You didn't.
I just showed you.
How do you enforce women in your society that are obliged to have children?
Social pressure and propaganda.
What if they won't do it? What if they refuse?
Then fine. It'll work for the most part. The propaganda will work.
If it's an obligation, it must be forced. That's the point of an obligation. Yes, you have an obligation to your country to not murder your fellows. If you do murder your fellows, you're put away. Yes.
You have an obligation, just like Jim Bob has an obligation to protect his home and his family. But if he decided that he was going to be a coward when the intruder breaks in, then he doesn't have to do that.
Then it's not an obligation. I don't even know why we're using this word.
That would call him a coward. And the social pressure and the feeling of obligation toward his family would make him want to do that, would make him want to step in between the intruder.
That's right.
An obligation must be enforceable or it's not an obligation.
He just gave you an example, right, of an obligation to defend your home. If it's failed, you don't get charged for failing to defend your home, correct?
That's because it's not an obligation to protect your home. It's something we think is good to do.
No.
It's a value.
Okay, so do you have an obligation to vote?
You don't have an obligation to vote, but it is a good thing to do.
Okay. Is an obligation basically a deontological statement, not a lawful statement?
What?
Is an obligation a deontological statement and not a lawful or a legal statement?
I guess I would ask you guys. You guys have been the one using obligation. What do you mean by that?
The answer, okay, this is
but
just
what I'm using it for is something legal. You are obliged as a citizen to do a number of things.
To be a good parent.
So, okay, one obligation. No, you don't. But actually, I think
go feminism. My point exactly.
This isn't a point of feminism. Good try, Jimmy.
You just heard her.
You actually. I'm changing my answer. Hold on, Jim Bob. Breathe. Can I answer the question or can I not? I know. You're really excited. So you do have an obligation to not be an abusive parent because then we would arrest you and put you in jail, right? When we're talking about obligations, laws are the obligations that you have. This is why if you're drafted, you are obliged to go to war. This is why IDF soldiers are obliged to enlist. Obligations are enforceable.
Are women obliged to enter the draft?
Selective service? No, they're not. Nobody is obliged to enter the draft right now.
Men are. So is that feminism or what?
I don't know why you're pivoting here. Do you want to actually engage? Well, you're pivoting.
That's ironic, right? You actually accuse someone of pivoting while you pivot, right? As the pivot. That's really great.
We were talking about obligations, and now you're being like, oh God, I got lost in the obligation argument. So I know the draft because she said the word draft. So I'll just jump there rather than have to engage with her obligation talking points.
Destina, calm down. So look, what just happened is you just made a statement about an obligation inside a military context, and I gave you an example of how men are obligated through law to be drafted and women aren't.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Because we have a patriarchal history where we believe that men should go to war and women shouldn't.
And why is that?
Because men are better frontline workers and we didn't believe that women could do the works of infantry. However, you could ask Ken, my understanding is a lot of that has been minimized over the years with technology.
Yeah.
Do you want to engage with the obligated talking point? Should we go back there? Because I know you're...
Well, no, we already refuted your talking point because you said because you said an obligation assumes a legal consequence, and Jake and myself both gave examples, right? Self-defense in the home is one.
That's not an obligation. It's a value. If it's not enforceable, it's not an obligation.
That's a win. That's a win in our direction because you're just arguing from a feminist view. That's not an obligation to be a good parent.
Okay. There's an obligation as a parent and a core value to be a good parent. An obligation is to not be an abusive or neglectful parent.
How does feminism produce an obligation to be a good parent?
Because if you want to empower women and have a better society for women, you want to have good children that have respect for law and respect for others and therefore respect one another.
Yeah, but what gives you the obligation? A feminist could actually reject that and be still a feminist, right?
At this point, Jim Bob, you need to define obligation because it seems like you're using the word in a way that nobody else is. Because when I say obligation and everyone else uses it, they mean enforceable.
Obligation being something you're pressured or compelled to do by a social standard, a social norms, right? From a theological view, even. For example, for a Christian, you have certain duties and obligations. They're set out, and you actually have other Christians call you out if you're failing that, right? Inside of your church. So is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Sorry, I was distracted by the super chat.
Is it a good thing? Is it a good thing if a group of people share values and obligations and they can call each other out on the failures of those obligations, even if it's outside of a legal framework?
Sure, if we're using obligations in the way that you are. Sure.
Does feminism have that?
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the obligation feminism has that you can call out another person who self-proclaims to be feminist, and you can say you're being a bad feminist? That's equal to a Christian saying you're not being consistent with your values and duties. What's one example of that?
Okay, within the feminist group, most feminists would call one another out, for example, for attacking other women's looks. And generally, there's a pretty core value, which is essentially what you're using instead of you saying obligation, but you mean value. One of the core values, for example, is like not objectifying women, not reducing them to their looks. So when other women call each other out or insult each other on their looks, almost all feminists will jump down the girl who's insulting the looks throat, because it's a pretty core value, for example, within feminism, not to do that.
And that's policed how?
It's well, how is anything else policed that you've just outlined?
Why do you ask a question? Because
have you not heard of Socrates? Debates can be Socratic in style, right?
Have you not heard of look?
Well,
lady,
unless you think he's not a debater, I can respond with questions.
You just refuted yourself, because just 10 minutes ago you said an obligation has to be tied to legality, and yet you just presented a social obligation inside feminism that doesn't include going to jail for making fun of someone's fat ass, right?
Okay. You're okay. I updated.
It has social shame.
Unbelievable. This chick is like, you're okay, and she's like, I'm not getting defeated in real time.
Wait.
You're okay.
Can I talk now? Am I allowed, sir?
No. You just refuted yourself.
I didn't.
Yeah, you can't talk. So what you did.
Moderator, can I talk, or am I just going to continue to get interrupted?
Didn't you hear me? So look.
I didn't realize that you ran the show now. Okay, I guess I'll just sit here.
Yeah, it is. You just contradicted yourself, because you said yes. Premise 1, an obligation has to be tied to a legal thing. Then you, in premise 2, you just stated when you're pressed on obligations inside feminism, you just said it's an obligation to not fat shame and make fun of people's bodies. Do you go to jail for that, ERUDITE?
So do you want to use my definition of obligation or yours?
So you're not going to answer the question.
Do you want to use my definition of obligation or yours?
This is what it's been like all night.
This is not what it's been like. I've answered you consistently. You asked about GDP. I answered you.
I asked if you go to jail if you make fun of someone's fat ass.
You don't go to jail, but again, you had swapped the definition of obligations to value system, which is what I started using. Do you go to jail if you don't defend your wife? Do you go to jail if you cheat on your wife?
No, that's in favor of my position.
So those
yours.
are obligations, but they're not enforceable obligations.
Yeah, that's in favor
that's
of my
your
position.
definition.
That's not yours. You're just borrowing our definitions now.
Okay.
Because you got roasted on yours.
Okay, good job. Thank you, Ken. I'm so sorry. And sorry, Jake, that this was your partner. Unfortunate, but it is what it is.
Oh, wow. More nonsense, non-argument.
Oh, no, she's being mean now. Uh-oh.
That's not mean. You can't. You don't have the capability of being mean. You have to be logical to be mean.
I wanted to ask if Jake and Ken wanted to jump in here, since the time, between.
Yeah, I think that it's an interest. I'm actually really enjoying the back and forth, to be honest. But what we're saying is that feminism is not good for society, because feminism has no obligations for women as to what is going to make society healthy. What Jim Bob is talking about here is the obligations that men do have in society, and one of those obligations is to be the enforcement arm of society. So, but not legally. The military and being the police and being the protectors in their family, for example. And this is actually something that, by and large, men do. And with feminism and the introduction of feminism, women are actually doing what the feminists say they should do, which is have no obligations to rear children, and this is why we have a falling birth rate. So this is just a W for our position, that feminism doesn't have any obligations or duties in society, and that's why it's destructive and corrosive.
So again, I feel like you guys forgot, you have swapped obligation back and forth between values and enforceable obligations. You have to just pick one. You can't use it for both. That's a Mott and Bailey, right? So if obligations Jim Bob, pause. It's okay. You let it turn. If obligations are enforceable, so your initial argument was that obligations are enforceable. Then once you realize that you have a whole bunch of obligations that are actually value systems and are not enforceable, you pivoted it, right? So
I didn't say that. You're such a liar. I said obligations are not enforced by legality. You said they were. We refuted you. Are you this demonic?
I think you just got lost in your own argument. It's okay, Jim Bob. If you want to update now and agree with me.
Did you not just say that obligations had to be legally bound? You said that. Not us.
I asked you if that's how you were using obligations.
No, you said it. You said obligations make no sense unless they're legally bound. That's what you said.
Okay. So for those who are listening who
Which
are
lady?
semi-good faith, the debate of this entire conversation was about not if feminism has obligations, it was whether feminism was good for society. Our main argument is that feminism is good for society because it creates a competition of innovation and allows for a better
Ben Shapiro.
meritocracy. Most soldiers are men is not a refutation of that point. So I assume that you don't disagree and have conceded the debate. I really appreciate you guys for coming out. I appreciate you guys agreeing that feminism is good for society. And I appreciate that you guys think that the GDP is improved by women being a part of it.
Cute. When are you going to be a mother? That's the only thing that matters here.
When are you going to join the military?
I don't need to join the military because the military is collectively men, right? And I'm the military of my household. So I already joined the military of my household. You, however, didn't do the duties of your household, right? You don't even have a household.
You don't know anything about me, but go for it.
Yeah. So what's your obligation as a feminist to society right now as an individual level?
There's never been a part of this debate where feminism must have obligations was a part of any of our.
Yes, it does.
It's not our belief. That might be your viewpoint.
No, I'll tell you right now.
Our affirmative viewpoint that we started from. I don't know why you need to be so cowardly. Okay, relax. Just listen for 2 seconds.
Right now, which you guys
My
can't refute.
starting argument, it's written down here. Feminism is good for society, yes, because it is the morally right thing to do. It's good for innovation. It's good for
Morally
productivity
right?
and the GDP. And it is those things lead to flourishing. Those are our
how is
affirmative
feminism in
statements.
action?
At no point in any of our affirmative statements do we say feminism must have obligations. That is your affirmative claim that you have to prove. You have to prove that
said-
feminism requires
No,
obligations.
You actually offered your own obligations under feminism. You're contradicting yourself.
No, I used value
So
systems because
is
you
it-
were swapping the word obligations for value
All right,
systems.
does a good society require law and order?
Yes.
Does feminism have an obligation to perform law and order?
This is an empty question, Jim Bob. We've already gone through this.
You mean
Again-
your mind is
Question is
empty.
what it
You mean
was.
your mind is empty.
No, it's because you don't even know what obligation means.
If a good society requires law and order, and feminism doesn't provide an obligation for law and order or any sort of participation in law and order, by the way, it doesn't. Why? As we've said a million times, which produced a number of silent moments in the
Feminism doesn't run society. We're not required to solve all of society or create a hierarchy.
You rely on society to be run, don't you?
That has nothing to do with anything about
Yes,
is
it
feminism
does.
good for
Feminism is a luxury.
Stop. Jim Bob,
It's a
our
luxury.
affirmative argument that you need to tackle is feminism is good for society. You establishing
and you know
other things that are good for society isn't really a problem. Feminism doesn't
You
run
said
society.
feminism is neutral.
I said it's good for
You said
society.
it's neutral.
I said it's
No, now you're
good.
lying. No, we can call back the tape. You said it's
I would
neutral.
love to call back the tape. Of course, the answer to the starting question of the debate is feminism good for society was yes. Sarah can affirm that because
said
we
sus-
agreed on the
you
topic.
said-
Sarah, did I agree to this topic to take the affirmative position
You said-
that
you said
feminism is good for
feminism is
society?
good for the you said feminism is good for the GDP. You haven't extrapolated how the GDP reaching any sort of number is good for the long term of society. Jake and I are arguing for foundational views, which you guys have none. If the GDP, again, I'll say it, if the GDP was at an exquisite position and you had a fucking golden light on it and you shot it into the sky like the Batman symbol, if there were no families, if there was no cohesive society with a set of values and customs and norms for it to reflect on, it's useless.
What does GDP mean, Jim Bob?
Gross domestic product?
What is it though? Like, what does it mean?
I'm actually not entirely sure how they extrapolate.
It's
what
how much you
actually
produce,
telling.
how much you produce as a society, pretty much.
Yeah, and what do we use it to establish about a society? Do you broadly know?
No, go ahead and tell
Well,
us.
it can be used to just establish the wealth of a society.
The wealth, but typically also people use it.
Productivity.
Yep, productivity and health of a society, right? The total
Health?
monetary.
Wait,
Yeah.
whoa. Health?
Yes, so the total monetary.
Wait a second. Hold on
Well,
a second.
Jake
hold on a second. I
agreed.
just want to stop there. No, one point at a time, Erudite. Are you meaning physical health or what?
Okay.
What do you mean by health? I have to know.
So GDP is a measure of goods and services produced within a country, right?
So if a country was legalized mass scale cocaine and heroin, as long as it increased the GDP, you'd argue that's good for the society?
It's a decent heuristic to measure how like
So it doesn't matter what they're doing, right? It could be like a a prostitution ring that was legal in a certain island, and the prostitution.
Yeah, it's not a moral
it
claim.
actually-
GDP is not a moral claim.
Hold on,
Yes.
Hold on. Well, the question is it good for society? It is totally fair to ask, ERUDITE, if a society has a really high GDP, being that that's your metric for good, right? If they produce a high GDP,
for strength.
but they're doing horrific. Hold on. If they're doing horrific things, is it still good for society?
Yeah, I would argue that
Yeah. Sex trafficking and all the rest, right?
Yeah,
Feminism,
that would be if there was a world where there was a country that had a sex trafficking ring market and it had high GDP, I would agree with you that it's an immoral country.
You do have this in a way, though, ERUDITE,
Amazing.
because China has one of the highest GDP. China has the second highest GDP in the world,
Mm-hmm.
and China is not a place that you would want to live, I'm assuming.
I agree, but I never said that GDP equals morality. I said that it is about country strength and it's good for society.
So GDP doesn't equal good.
GDP doesn't equal moral good. It equals strength.
So you're not making a meta-ethical position of what's good for society. You're just saying what's pragmatic. Is that what it is? We're just finding this out now?
Yeah, we're talking about what is good for society, and typically when we're talking about that, we're talking about what benefits the nation
Benefits
state.
based on their arbitrary goals?
For example, if you are a country with low GDP and you're forced up against China, they're going to stomp you, which means their bad moral system might get all over your stuff. So if you're a country that you broadly like your moral system, you want to have a strong GDP to help compete.
So what's more important, the moral system of the society or the GDP from a feminist view?
From a feminist view?
Yeah, that's the one you're fucking debating tonight.
Sure. Being able to defend yourself is good. Yes.
I didn't say about defending yourself.
That's what GDP allows for. If you have a stronger GDP, you can defend yourself better.
This is like a real life witch we have here. So the question was, what's more important? You're a duh. The high GDP or the morality of the people?
Broadly, I value the morality of the people, but if you can't defend yourself, I've never said GDP is morally good. But if you are a decently, I think America's broadly morally good. There's some problems in it, but I like the precepts of America. If we don't have a high GDP, we can't defend ourselves. We need the ability to protect ourselves, right? Which GDP is good for.
But ERUDITE, you're saying that the problem is that that China could stomp you out or whatever. So you're actually saying that the important thing here in your view is that you have a strong military, and you have a strong military that's going to be made up of men in order to be able to defend your society. That's what you're really saying.
That's not what I'm saying.
The GDP
Let me
allows
ask
you
you,
to have a
is a
strong
strong
military.
enforcement arm a moral good?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Okay, so GDP then, by your logic, is good morally because it allows you to have a strong enforcement arm.
But how does that relate though?
Because you just said that a strong enforcement arm is good and GDP allows you to have a strong enforcement arm. That's how you protect yourself in large part, is through soft and whatnot. You need a high GDP to have a strong military. So I guess high GDP.
How does that make feminism good for society?
Because feminism allows women to enter the workforce, which increases your GDP, which is good for society. So I guess by that, by your own logic, Jim Bob, pause. By your own logic, Jake, feminism, at least in how it benefits GDP, is a moral good because it creates a stronger enforcement arm.
China has a high GDP. China has a high GDP and a strong military.
Yeah, is that good?
For China, yeah.
Okay.
Right, but you can have that without feminism. So the feminism isn't adding anything new.
So do you guys not think, well, feminism, the part of feminism that I care about, China has, right? Because women are allowed to be in the workforce in China.
ERUDITE, your example just isn't relevant though, because you're trying to piece together things that don't necessarily need to be together. So for example, Iran has proxies all over the Middle East. You'd say that they have a strong military. Are they a feminist country?
They have a much weaker military than us. I would not say they have a particularly strong military.
But relative to their size, though, for their size and for their GDP, etc., they have a strong military. They have proxies all over the Middle East. They have a lot of influence, but they're not the biggest country. They don't have the biggest GDP. They don't have the biggest GDP, and they're not a feminist country, but they have a pretty strong military.
They haven't. My understanding is Iran has an okay-ish. It's got a lot of old technology. It definitely doesn't seem to be able to strongly compete with Israel.
Look,
because there's a Samson protocol across all the Middle East, because they all agree that if they try to wipe out each other, they'll just nuke everyone. Do you not know what the Samson protocol of Israel is?
Is it possible to produce a high GDP and completely be anti-feminist?
Not if you don't allow women to enter the workforce. Not in the current global climate. No.
Is it logically possible to produce a high GDP and not adopt any of the feminist views?
Well, are you saying women in the workforce is one of those feminist views?
Well, I mean, women have always been a part of the workforce. There's no moment where suddenly feminism was on the rise and then suddenly people were allowed to work. Women were, even before all of what you call your amazing moments forward in progress, they were still able to work. The question was whether it was more valuable to work or to be mothers of the home. I'm saying on net balance, isn't it possible that any given state or nation state could actually produce a high GDP and be completely antithetical to feminism? The answer is yes. Here's why. You can enslave a bunch of women in a society and they just determine that that's lawful, and you can sell those women to other nations and they deem that's lawful, and they can produce a high GDP and it's completely antithetical to feminism, correct? If that's the case, ERUDITE, it means that your metric for what feminism is producing as a good isn't peculiar to feminism, because anything can produce a high GDP, including horrendous, atrocious behavior.
Well, you guys argued.
Would you like to move on? Would you like to move on to a different shitty argument?
Well, you guys made this argument, right? You guys agreed that a strong enforcement. Yeah, I asked Jake, do you think a strong enforcement arm is good, like a moral good? And you said yes. And you said
that wasn't an argument. You asked him a question. You made the argument.
No, I asked him, does he think a strong enforcement arm is good? And he said yes.
And I said yes. I think that a strong enforcement arm of the government is good. Just like in your home, it's good to enforce. Just good to have force in your home and to be able to protect your family. That's a good thing. Just like it's good to be able to protect your nation. But your example that you gave, saying, well, then we must have feminism because feminism allegedly increases GDP, and if you have a high GDP, you have a strong military. I gave you an example of another country, Iran, that has a pretty strong military, and they're doing okay with protecting their people at the moment. They don't have the highest GDP in the world, and they're most certainly not feminists.
I don't know if anyone would
look... What's the other metric then for feminism producing good stuff if it's not GDP?
Okay.
If we just
I can.
Feminism.
I need to go in like 5. I'll re-explain my opening statement again to you, and then you're going to have to be on your own with this one. So my argument is that feminism tries to empower women. But one of the ways it empowers women is by allowing them to enter the workforce. My argument is that by inviting women into the workforce, it gives you the ability to compete with other nations' GDP. If you cannot compete with other nations' GDP, you will be crushed because your enforcement arm will be weak. And that would be bad for your society. Also, Rachel Wilson, genuinely hope you're feeling better. Heard you were not doing well.
If you don't have kids, lady, if you don't have kids for the GDP to benefit, right, then
these aren't exclusive.
We ask you, and you just turn this into some sort of false dichotomy. No, right now, ERUDITE, if you look across the world, the population is in decline, and there is a necessary component that needs to be implemented through some sort of campaign, marketing, propaganda, and you guys are just oblivious to it. That we need more humans, right? So you keep LARPing and fucking, romanticizing the GDP, and we ask you for what? For what society that doesn't exist? We need women out of the workforce and into homes to produce the human beings that you think the GDP would benefit. Do you understand?
Okay, so you're basically not refuting any of my affirmative claim. That's good. I guess I won.
It's just unbelievable. Unbelievable.
You're just coming up with other well, the issue is you're just non sequitur. You're literally coming up with other random. I know. But the problem is that you're kind of a cowardly, weak man who can't control your feelings, who can't stop interrupting other men. Well, the issue is that you can't
deserve a husband. You don't even deserve a family.
That's a pretty insane claim to make, Jim Bob. I genuinely hope that you do well and flourish in your life. The issue is that you haven't refuted my affirmative claim. You're making other random affirmative claims. My affirmative claim, I'll read it again to you.
The GDP go uppy up.
Close. What's good about a GDP is that you can...
What's good about it?
have a stronger enforcement arm, which allows you to defend yourself.
Men? You mean men, not women.
So ridiculous.
What the hell's wrong with you?
I'm glad that you guys feel really comfortable in your worldview.
Enforcement arm
It's good
to
for
give
you.
me the sense of luxury and liberation.
Look, if you have an answer against my affirmative claim that GDP is good and therefore feminism infusing more women into the workplace is good, go for it. If you want to make rather random claims, I don't have time to break them all down for you.
Your argument is moot, dude.
An army of all men with no money will lose. Ask Hamas.
So erudite. Should we then have a societal enforcement, for example, where women were forced to enter the workforce and they had to do their 12 hours a day of labor in order to make the GDP higher, so that we could then have a stronger military?
Nope. I don't believe in violating rights like that. I'm a liberal Democrat.
Rights that are enforced
Should
by
we have
men?
propaganda, social propaganda, so that women should have to go into the workforce, produce the amount of labor that is good for the state, so that the state can then have a stronger military, so we can crush China?
No, I think that we should. I think we should allow it. Basically, we should allow women to enter the workforce.
GDP. But the GDP.
Yeah, I value rights and
We should be
freedoms
aiming
more.
to get the GDP up.
Yeah, typically women will opt to enter the workforce because having more money is good, but I will allow it. I don't feel the need to force them. I think people will naturally choose towards it anyways.
Is feminism itself, like, because you said rights and stuff, right? But like we pointed out today pretty clearly that if it were
if we're going down another tangent, Jim Bob, I don't have time for this.
No, calm down.
Well, if it's not going to be about GDP,
maybe take one of your pills. I see them in the back. Take one of those. So the question is, if men, because you keep saying rights and shit like this, right? Everything you're arguing relies on predominantly a patriarchal system. Feminism is antithetical to patriarchy. So this is what's so bothersome about feminists, including Ken there, right? Who's probably wearing a sports bra. So the question is, anything you say about feminism that's good relies wholly on something that's not actually feminist. And you guys haven't actually dealt with this problem foundationally. Jake and I are going foundation. You guys are going topical. You guys go to the core and to the bricks. You guys go to the
is
siding,
allowing
right?
women to enter the workforce feminist?
What?
Is allowing women?
What are you mumbling about?
At the end of the day, the proof is in the reality of societies that embrace feminism versus those that don't. And I guarantee you,
Damn right.
Bob, Jake, you wouldn't want to live in
love
any of those
Iran,
societies.
love Hamas and North Korea. Let's go, baby! The pinnacles of Christianity.
That's such a red herring.
All right.
That's such a red herring.
Not
By
so
the way,
erudite is spontaneously combusting.
Jake literally loves Hamas so much. He's just like,
can I ask you a question?
I love Hamas.
Jim Bob, ask one last question. Ken, give your last thought, and then we'll move into closing statements, please.
Is it possible for a society to push against feminism and not be Islamicist?
Sure.
Okay, cool. Then shut the fuck up.
I don't understand the point of that. I think
because your argument was, oh no, Muslims. That's all your argument is, dude.
Not at all. The point is, societies that have embraced feminism do better across every metric. Ergo, feminism is good.
Really? Is that why the birth rate is so low?
I don't know.
I don't know.
Not improving society.
What is a society without children,
innovation and feminism?
Innovation. What is innovation without children, Ken?
Feminism allows for having children.
What is
name for me?
I didn't say it didn't.
Is not having children. It just affords women the option.
Kendra,
like you have the option not to join the military. You deserve that choice, right?
Why? Why do I
have the option to have kids or not? That's
why? Why do we deserve that? What are you talking about? We deserve it. Israel. This is what's so funny. This guy Ken starts with IDF. Does IDF have the right to choose not to go to the military, Ken?
Does IDF have the right
to going in?
Doesn't even make sense.
Israeli.
Does IDF?
Ken, chill out, Ken. So, if you're an Israeli citizen, do you have the choice, the feminist choice, to enter the military or not?
If you're Orthodox, yeah, you don't have to.
If you're Orthodox, okay. So, for the most part,
the answer to the question is yes.
For the most part, you're compelled.
You asked the question, I answered.
You're such a snake.
As I can.
You're such an absolute snake. Look, it's compelled by law to enter the military in Israel for the most part. No, I didn't ask for the exception, Ken. I know feminism relies on the exception for everything. Ken, for the most part, if you're a citizen in Israel, are you compelled by law to enter the military? Yes or no,
For the most part, yeah.
Great, thank you. Why did it take so long? You're like a woman.
Well, because that's not the question you asked. I answered the question you asked.
So, no, you were saying, oh, I just want to give people choice. That's feminist. Yet your example for choice is actually not choice. It's actually compelled by government.
My example for choice is actually the U.S. and the feminist society that we've built.
Oh,
that
so
gives
should
women the option.
Should they have the option, or should they? No, no. I don't have the option if I'm drafted. Women aren't drafted.
God, I have the choice to shut this bitch down whenever I want. We're gonna go ahead and maneuver into closing statements, everyone. Jake, would you like to go ahead and start?
Yeah, I think that this was quite honestly an embarrassment for the feminist point of view. All they really said was the GDP, the graph go up. We gave many examples of when the graph go up isn't necessarily good and why that doesn't even align with feminism. So it was an extremely weak point. We gave certain duties and obligations that people have in society to make a healthy and thriving society to their detriment. The feminists even agreed that these things were good, but they have no obligations to do the things that make the healthy society. And everything that they appealed to required the force of men and required the force doctrine, and the force is enforced by men. So it was a resounding W, and off to Jim Bob.
Go ahead, Jim Bob.
Yeah, I agree with Jake here. Complete embarrassment. As far as there's so many contradictions, especially ERUDITE, who's maybe used to a chat that doesn't call her out on her contradictions. Ken's appeal to look at the ladies at the airport. I mean, this is his argument for the amazing performance of women in the military. When we ask him point blank, if you're going to choose between a collection of men and women to defend you, is it totally equalized? He says, no. I mean, you got to choose the men. Why? Well, because the nature of men and women are different. Because the nature of men or women are different, their actual being is different. Their makeup is different. It follows that their duties are different. From Jake and myself, our position is that feminism actually argues against and tries to invert and try to equalize men and women, trying to blur the lines that men aren't the enforcers and women aren't the caregivers and the baby makers and providers. And we're arguing that a society, through a variety of argumentations, including my own and Jake's, we actually basically demonstrated that a society that's good requires these elements. The elements are force. You need force, okay? A good society requires law and order. They admitted law and order requires predominantly the force of men. I don't care about your exceptions where there's some brute chick named Tanya who can pick up the backside of a tank. I don't care. The collective is men. It needs to be men. It's never the collective of women. Premise 3, society requires the force of men. That's called a patriarchy. Now, I know ERUDITE didn't like this. She was like, well, you're just conflating that men actually have the say in everything because they have the say in the force. That's not patriarchy. I don't know what it is if it's not patriarchy. If it's the case that a collection of men could take away your silly rights to vote, ERUDITE, to vote for your shitty policies, we could actually do that. Guess what? A collection of women couldn't stop it from happening. I call that a patriarchy. Conclusion. A patriarchy is actually necessary for a good or bad society. I'll actually include. Feminism is required for neither. In fact, the only thing that's required of feminism is to make a shitty society where women like to yeet their own kids and get a lanyard to work at Nike and call it a win so they could start a blog.
Just really quickly, Sarah, do you mind if I just add one point to my closing statement? It's
Sure,
something
why not?
that I just like,
Yours was pretty short.
especially Ken to be able to contend with. It's that I can understand when women are feminists. I mean, I think that it's completely the wrong approach to take, but I think that there's something in the natural makeup of women that will go towards it. But Ken, I never understand male feminists, and I have a theory about this. There's a zoological term called the sneaky fucker strategy, right? And this is not me saying, this is actually what it's called. It's called the sneaky fucker strategy. And
I know where you're
basically,
going.
what will happen is that pufferfish and other animals will actually try and morph into the physiology of the female to try and blend in with them to get past the other males to try and actually mate with the females. So I think that male feminism is something that's designed for beta males to actually go and try and have a mating strategy with females. And I'd like to hear you contend with that. But yeah, I think notsoErudite was next.
Go ahead, ERUDITE. The floor is yours.
Okay, sure. I guess I'll start first and foremost. Rachel Wilson was supposed to be here instead of Jim Bob, but she was had a pretty serious health issue. So I'm hoping genuinely the best for Rachel, and also really wish she was here. I think she can hold her own a fair bit better than Jim Bob, and somehow is like way less emotional and like upsetty spaghetti as Jim Bob. So I really do wish you were here, Rachel. Kind of a missed opportunity, but maybe next time. For response to all of this, by my own opponent's admission, it is a product of feminism that women entered the workforce. Women entering the workforce is required for a competitive GDP. A competitive GDP is required to protect yourself from other countries. Otherwise, other military advancements would result in your destruction. So by my opponent's admission, it's imperative to be able to defend yourself as a country. Therefore, by their own logic, allowing women into the workforce must be good, because without women in the workforce, a nation's GDP will be dwarfed by others. No economist on the planet would disagree with the notion that reducing your workforce by half would allow for a competitive GDP. America is currently in a very difficult predicament wherein China's approaching America's GDP. And if the trend continues and China's GDP is meaningfully surpassing America's, we will find ourselves in a genuine, unironic global catastrophe. It will be very bad because of their superior GDP. It will make their dollar more valuable, which we have a lot of hegemonic power related to our dollar, and a higher GDP, to be clear, is not inherently good forever, but it must be competitive or you will be destroyed. And I fundamentally believe that an American global hegemon and an America policed dominantly by a globe policed by dominantly American values and American policy is a better globe, which is why we should continue to allow women in the workforce, which is why feminism is good, at least for that specific thing. Not all things are perfectly good and bad. There's lots of bad parts about feminism. We just didn't really get to that. And Jake, I've always found you to be an incredibly good faith debate opponent. So I apologize for making the dick sucking joke at you. That was bad faith of me. And I think you've been mostly good faith.
The technique was actually pretty good, Carla.
Thank you. I've practiced.
I appreciated the technique.
Yeah, as a whore, yeah. Jim Bob, you have a glorious beard that you don't deserve. So that's my last thoughts.
Do you want to fight me? I'll physically fight you.
Well, I don't think you should assault women. That feels like antithetical to all of your beliefs.
If you want.
Oh my God.
You want to?
Yeah, you want to assault a woman? Go for it.
No, I'm asking you if you want to fight me.
Children, we have open panel for the fun shit. Ken, would you like to give your closing statements, please?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. This has been a fascinating experience as my first debate in this kind of forum. It's been really fun to watch. Thanks for bringing it, Jake and Jim Bob. Look, I think all you really need to know to appreciate the proposition that feminism makes society better is that Jake and Jim Bob wouldn't be caught dead living in a society that didn't have feminism. We've given example after example after example of places they could go or things they could do if they had the balls to do it. But you know what? Neither of them joined the military. Neither have been to a place like Ukraine or Afghanistan. The societies that have embraced feminism are where they want to live and where they want to raise their families.
Thank you, Ken. I appreciate that. Let's, ERUDITE, you mentioned you were leaving. Did you want to?
No, I need to head off. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Sarah. I really, really appreciate it. It was a good time. And Jim Bob, you look like your victim weight. You should probably work on your shoulders and your wrists. They're a little thin.
Do you want to fight me or not?
Look, I love that your soy range by the end results in you assaulting violence against
Jim
women.
Bob,
I will fight you.
Good Catholic, by the way.
I'm going to fight you because Jesus, Lord have mercy. You need to fight.
Oh, weak men, man.